Our story begins with a father who was, by all accounts, a hideously ugly goblin. But you, little goblin, are not only ridiculously handsome, you also possess a mature mind and a brutally decisive nature. Your mother, the one who brought you into this world, is a woman as breathtakingly beautiful as a fairy. And, to make matters even more interesting, you were an elite assassin before your reincarnation. When we see him open his eyes, he finds a beautiful woman before him, trembling from head to toe. He looks at her and asks, quite simply, if she is his mother. But before she can answer, the other goblin hatchlings born alongside him lunge toward her, driven by primal instinct. Relying on his past life instincts, he pounces on one and pins it to the ground, ignoring its desperate struggles to break free. He grabs the first stone he finds and slams it into the creature's neck, ending its life in a single, cold instant. A system voice echoes in his mind, offering congratulations for the kill. At the very moment of his birth, he has already eliminated one of his own kind with lightning-fast brutality. He has gained the malice skill and a point of strength, a productive first day, to be honest. He ignores the system's voice. Instead, he touches the cords still connecting them, feeling a deep bond of blood. And then, a truly macabre smile begins to spread across his face. There is no doubt he is her son, yet from the corner, the beautiful woman watches him with absolute despair. She has only just given birth and lacks the strength to defend herself from what is happening. In that precise moment, another goblin hatchling approaches him with stealthy intent. It attacks suddenly, but in a purely instinctive reaction, the woman throws herself over him to protect him, taking the blow herself. A mouthful of blood spills from her lips as she shields her newborn child. But for him, having just felt the warmth of a mother's embrace, seeing that blood trickling down her face changes everything. We see a sudden, uncontrollable fury begin to take hold of him. In his past life, to be perfectly honest, he was nothing more than a ruthless killing machine. The only emotion he had ever been taught was absolute obedience to his mother. And so, without a second's hesitation, he picks up another heavy stone. He slams it down with brutal force against the other goblin hatchling. Once again, that mysterious system voice echoes within his mind. It offers its congratulations for killing yet another goblin hatchling. Thanks to the unique effects of his devour skill, he gains a reward. He earns a point of speed, though his sudden brutality has left everyone in a state of shock. But in this precise moment, he has only one thing on his mind. He is determined to eliminate every single hatchling trying to defile his space. He won't let them hurt his mother. After finishing off 2 hatchlings in a row, things change. The rest of the brood finally realizes exactly what is happening. They begin to let out furious roars, turning their attention toward him. The nest is immediately plunged into a scene of absolute chaos. However, a flash of cold, murderous intent shines brightly in his eyes. One after another, he delivers strikes with terrifying precision. He aims directly for the back of the hatchlings' necks, ending them instantly. The sound of the system announcing his various upgrades becomes a constant drone. It simply doesn't stop ringing. By now, he has already killed 10 of them. By now, he has already undergone more than 10 distinct strengthenings. We can see that he clearly feels the profound changes taking hold of his body. At this point, he isn't just significantly stronger in every possible aspect. He has also managed to obtain a truly formidable new skill. But right at that moment, the old wooden door is suddenly thrown wide open. Light floods the dark room, revealing a scene that makes one wonder what on earth is happening. 2 adult goblins enter the room and take a quick look around. Good grief, the entire room has become a complete and utter shambles. And there he is, looking like a monster, the first true monster one can see at a glance. At first, the adults naturally assumed this was the work of the breeding slaves. That is, until the 2 hatchlings surviving in the corner caught their eye. The moment he sees them, he knows he has to act fast. He accelerates his movements immediately, intent on crushing the remaining hatchling. Just as the stone is about to impact the goblin hatchling's head, the other adult goblin reaches out and grabs him firmly by the foot. Seeing the danger, he leaps into the air to dodge the incoming grasp. While suspended in midair, he hurls the stone directly into the hatchling's left eye. Noticing it hasn't died yet, he prepares himself to deliver the final, decisive blow. As the adult goblin lunges to stop him, he throws a handful of sand right into its face. Immediately after, another stone falls with a thud, delivered with truly incredible precision. The projectile landed with perfect accuracy, striking the adult goblin right in the eye. He quickly closed the distance, finding himself once again face to face with the creature. He was just about to deliver the final, finishing blow when the situation shifted. The goblin shaman, who had been watching silently from the side, finally decided to intervene. The old wretch waved his staff with a sudden, practiced motion, and from the cold ground, a mass of thick vines suddenly erupted. They ensnared him instantly, lifting him up and suspending him helplessly in the air. He wondered where these plants had come from and why they were moving to bind him. The shaman sneered, insulted that a mere brat would dare to be so arrogant. He intended to teach him a lesson about the consequences of massacring his own kind. The shaman mocked his blindness as the goblin's club was just about to descend upon him. But right at that critical moment, the elf who had been hiding in the shadows moved. From her dark corner, she suddenly lunged forward with unexpected speed. She threw her arms around him to protect him, even as the others shouted for her to move. The goblin demanded to know why she was stopping him after this monster killed dozens of them. She stood her ground, stating she had already informed the general who would decide the boy's fate. At the mere mention of the general, the goblins froze, regardless of how furious they were. They no longer dared to lay a single finger on him, which was a lucky break, to be honest. Such was the absolute power of the goblin general, the undisputed leader of this entire den. However, it wasn't long before the goblins' attention was diverted by something else entirely. Their eyes turned toward the elf who was still holding him protectively in her arms. With a malicious smile, the goblin sneered that while he might not be able to touch the boy now, he could certainly dishonor his mother right in front of his very eyes. Sensing the filthy intentions they had toward his mother, the fury in his heart ignited once again with terrifying intensity. In an instant, he tore himself free from the vines that had been binding him, and before anyone could react, he appeared right at the goblin's side. He dodged the counterattack with a lateral shift and, in the same breath, a violent spin. In less than 3 movements, he had completely ripped the creature's arm off. The goblin collapsed to the ground, thrashing about in absolute agony. Good grief, not again. Another adult goblin simply couldn't take it anymore. He lunged forward, raising his heavy axe high into the air. But just as he was about to let the blade fall, an imposing voice rang out, stopping him dead in his tracks. The goblins pleaded with the general, demanding that he deliver justice for them. They argued that the child had only just been born and was already a killer. They felt they couldn't possibly spare his life after he had slaughtered dozens of their kind. The general asked if they had really been defeated so easily by a mere newborn. He wondered how they still had the nerve to come and complain to him after such a disgrace. Addressing the boy as a goblin slayer, he told him to speak, as Samantha the shaman nodded in agreement. And so, he explained everything that had transpired with surprising clarity. After listening to the whole story, the general's gaze settled. He looked directly at the boy, who was still standing protectively in front of the elf. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed those piercing eyes, but he masked it quickly, asking if it was truly he who had killed them all. He repeated the question as the boy stood ready to defend his mother with his very life. He said nothing, not daring to relax his guard for even a single second. He could sense that the goblin standing before him was immensely powerful. So powerful, in fact, that even at his best, he would have to proceed with extreme caution. Seeing that he remained silent, Samantha the shaman stepped forward. She reminded the general that it was perfectly normal for a newborn not to be able to speak yet. They generally need to move past the infant stage before they truly begin to develop. If that was the case, they would simply wait until he could speak before deciding his fate. Right then, a wave of intense dizziness suddenly washed over him. And just like that, he collapsed, though fortunately, his mother was there to catch him. He woke up a short while later, only to find that he and his mother were being taken to a prison. We see that many young women were being held captive there. To be honest, it was a grim sight. Every one of them was being used by the goblins. They were treated as nothing more than simple tools to ensure the tribe's offspring. But he soon noticed a pattern every time the goblins came to drag one of the girls away. Their screams of hysteria and agony echoed throughout the cold, damp prison. Every time it happened, his mother would quickly cover his ears and eyes. She did her best to shield him, even while she herself trembled and wept with fear. Seeing her in such a state, he asked her with genuine concern, "Mother, what's wrong?" A goblin standing nearby happened to overhear his innocent question. Suddenly, the creature let out a harsh, mocking burst of laughter. "What's wrong?" he sneered. "She's going to become our new toy, of course." As if struck by a terrible memory, his mother let go of him, her gaze turning empty and distant. He reached out with his small hand and gently stroked her head to comfort her. That simple gesture managed to calm her mind, which had been right on the verge of breaking. He told her not to cry, but the goblins outside the iron door were truly enjoying themselves. It seemed that the more fear the prey felt, the more excited the goblin became. He told her to just enjoy it, because in a few days' time, his mother would belong to all of them, wearing a very specific expression. She whispered, "Don't worry," repeatedly, while in the shadows, he watched the goblins as they left. He made sure to burn the face of the goblin, leading them into his memory. Deep down, he knew his mother was crying because of that miserable wretch. He told himself that if he killed that scoundrel, his mother would finally stop crying. So, as soon as night fell, he took advantage of a moment of carelessness from the goblins guarding the hallway. Using his unique ability, he simply melted into the shadows. And just like that, he escaped from the cage with ease. Since the goblins had been dragging people out of the cells one by one, their vigilance had become quite relaxed, a fatal mistake, as it turns out. It didn't take him long to evade the goblins. On patrol, and he began to search everywhere. He was looking for the specific goblin who had humiliated his mother that morning. After stealthily taking down the goblins on patrol, he finally located his target for the night. At that very moment, the creature was trying to assault the woman in front of him. "No, please, someone save me," she pleaded in desperation. "It's useless," the goblin sneered. "Even if you tear your throat screaming, no one is coming." The goblin licked his lips in anticipation, just as he was preparing to enjoy himself. With the beauty before him, a metallic flash pierced right through his neck. The goblin's lecherous smile froze forever on his face. In the very next instant, his head was rolling across the floor. Cress still didn't understand what was happening when she saw him standing in the corner. She assumed he must be an adventurer, a high-ranking one from the guild, no doubt. Someone who, after accepting the mission, used a skill to disguise himself as a child. And so, he had infiltrated the nest to gather information. Just as he was preparing to leave the scene, she stopped him, calling out, "Wait, master. Could you please get me out of here?" she pleaded. He ignored her at first and turned around to walk away. But a moment later, he turned back and returned to the body. He snatched the dagger that was hanging from the goblin's waist. To be honest, he was more than satisfied with this new weapon. Dawn was fast approaching, so he stealthily made his way back to the cell. He curled up in his mother's arms again and fell into a deep sleep until morning. We see him being jolted awake by the harsh shouts of a group of goblins. He frowned and looked up, seeing 3 goblins standing outside the iron bars. "Hey, were you the one who killed that goblin?" one demanded. Just as he was standing up, ready to kill those wretched creatures outside, his mother held him back, while the one-eyed goblin noticed he was being ignored. And, naturally, he became enraged in an instant. "You damn brat, do you really dare to ignore me?" he spat. "Very soon, you won't be a child anymore. And by then, your mother will have to give you some other siblings." He simply thought the one-eyed goblin was far too ugly for his own good. And so, he threw a stone at him, nearly splitting the creature's face open. The other goblin flew into a blind rage immediately. At that moment, the goblin shaman intervened, demanding that they stop. "This matter is already settled," he declared. "It was the woman we captured yesterday." The one-eyed goblin clearly wanted to say something more, but the shaman simply shut him down with a single, piercing glare. We watch as the 3 goblins finally turn and walk away. He and his mother were safe, at least for the time being. He could see quite clearly that his mother despised this place. And in secret, he swore an oath to massacre every last one of the goblins. His plan was to escape with his mother, but before he could act, something unexpected happened. That morning, a pair of goblins arrived at the cell to take his mother away. "I don't have to tell you what for, or perhaps I do. You can come too, brat," the goblin sneered. "So you can watch how much fun we have with your mommy." The one-eyed goblin's words provoked a wave of cruel laughter from the others. To be honest, the insults directed at him didn't matter in the slightest. But there was no way on earth he was going to allow those goblins to continue. They were insulting his mother, and just as he was about to lunge, she held him back. "Calm down, my love," she whispered. "Wait for me here. Mom will be back in just a moment," she said, as his eyes grew wide with shock. He wanted to lunge forward and kill those monsters who had dared to insult his mother. However, the goblin wasn't intimidated in the slightest, not by a mere child. "Don't worry, I'll make sure to take very good care of your mother and savor her." The goblin, clearly eager to taste such a delicacy, couldn't contain his malice. He raised his hand, preparing to strike his mother across the face. But just as he was about to deliver the blow, something shifted. That arm went flying, and a second later, a thin line of blood appeared on his neck. He died instantly. After all, did they really think he would let them take his mother? "Have you lost your mind? You're going to regret this, you little brat," the other shouted. Seeing the situation spiral out of control, the goblin mage stepped forward. He prepared to strike him down using his destructive fire magic. However, before he could even begin to cast his spell, the boy moved. He had already appeared above him, grabbing his head and slamming it into the ground. He continued until he heard the familiar, cold chime of the system. "Congratulations, you have successfully killed a goblin. You have obtained the goblin's innate skill, Fireball." We see the remaining goblins freeze in place, completely paralyzed by the sight. But the one-eyed goblin didn't look afraid. Instead, he smiled with pure arrogance. "Look at him. He's violating the general's orders and killing his own brothers. Catch him. Finish off this insolent brat," he shouted, his voice echoing with rage. The one-eyed goblin felt entirely confident in his victory, which, as we know, is usually a mistake. But, much to his surprise, instead of backing away or showing fear, he simply vanished into the shadows, leaving the goblins to search for him frantically in every direction. But they found no trace of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. Suddenly, a brilliant flash of light cut through the darkness of the scene. And just like that, another head went flying through the air. After that, every single time he reappeared, the result was exactly the same. We see that even among goblins, there is a sense of order and community within their village. Because of this, the one-eyed goblin stood paralyzed with shock, and in that moment, the system displayed a special message. His strength had finally reached the absolute limit for this current stage. As he continued to massacre them one after another, his power only seemed to grow. Soon enough, all of his other attributes reached their maximum capacity as well. But he paid no attention to the numbers. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the one-eyed goblin. He was ready, at last, for the final reckoning. The one-eyed goblin was so utterly terrified that he began to break out in a cold sweat. The only thing he could think to do was push the elf woman in front of him as a shield. "Wait, this will all be over in just a second," he whispered, his intent clear. "Son, no." His mother stopped him before he could take another step forward. She knew that, for any race, goblins are considered an incredibly detestable existence. She feared that if she let you keep killing, there might no longer be a place for you here. But, in the blink of an eye, you appeared right in front of the one-eyed goblin. Just as you were about to strike, a dark shadow emerged out of nowhere. And much to your surprise, this newcomer stopped your dagger in its tracks. So, you're the one everyone has been talking about lately, the figure remarked. The strange cub, your strength is truly monstrous, isn't it? He noted that when he was your age, his own strength wasn't even half of yours. In fact, in the entire nest, only the general as a child could have compared to you. Upon seeing the goblin knight, the one-eyed goblin felt as if he'd found his savior. He threw himself toward the knight and broke into a desperate sob. Sir Knight, you've finally arrived, he wailed. Look, this brat has killed every single one of our brothers. However, before he could even finish his sentence, you had already pressed your dagger against his throat. But at the crucial moment, a massive silver sword intervened. Do you really intend to murder someone in my presence? The knight asked. The goblin knight gripped his greatsword and swung it with immense force. In the next instant, you felt nothing but an overwhelming power surging toward you, and your entire body was sent flying until you crashed hard against the wall. Yet, the moment we saw you again, you were already preparing to lunge once more. But then, his mother stopped him, calling out to her son. She pleaded with him not to do it, knowing he couldn't possibly win. The goblin knight is a high-ranking species among their kind, after all. He serves under the direct command of the goblin general's own knights. In fact, he is the #1 high-class goblin in the hierarchy. He simply isn't someone the boy can face at this moment. Besides, killing a high-ranking goblin is considered a very grave crime. As you are now, it's impossible for you to beat me, the knight declared. He suggested the boy take advantage of the fact that he was still in a good mood. But before the goblin knight could even finish telling him to get away from the elf, the boy had already appeared right behind him. Dagger in hand, he struck, but the knight calmly blocked the attack. As the knight felt the boy's strength beginning to surge, a slow, dark smile began to spread across his face. Suddenly, a wicked idea seemed to occur to him. He continued, taunting that if the boy didn't hurry up and kill him, his mother would be the one to die, and he had barely finished the sentence before the boy unleashed a flurry of truly furious attacks. It was a display that even managed to surprise the goblin knight. To think that a mere cub could possess such overwhelming power. It is truly terrifying, but here we see him standing his ground. Compared to high-ranking goblins, he is seen as nothing more than an insect. The goblin knight then launched a strike with all of his formidable strength. Finding an opening, he lunged with a direct thrust aimed straight for the heart. Fortunately, he managed to defend himself with his dagger just in time. But even so, the sheer force of the impact sent him flying backward. Almost at the same moment, a metallic flash shot out from his hand. The one-eyed goblin, who was merely standing by as a spectator, suddenly saw his own head fall to the ground. Yes, just like that. It was then that the goblin knight realized he had been completely deceived. The boy had killed a goblin right under his very nose. Right at that moment, a terrifying wave of power began to surge. It emanated from deep within him, under the effect of the king's seed talent. His path of growth had taken a slight and rather unexpected deviation. With a sudden roar, bolts of electricity began to race across his body. They snaked frantically around him, like a violent rain of sparks. He underwent an astonishing transformation right before our eyes. He didn't just grow 40 centimeters in a single instant. The very lines of his body became more fluid, lean, and powerful. With his head held high and his chest out, he stood completely changed. You looked exactly like a high-ranking goblin yourself. Goblin Knight, kill that brat, the leader screamed. That single goblin's cry quickly incited the voices of all the others. Soon, the entire horde began clamoring for your death. Upon hearing the other goblins, the Goblin Knight simply paused. He made a casual gesture with his hand and remarked, well, not bad at all. This is certainly no low-level goblin we're dealing with. He had barely finished speaking when a silhouette appeared out of nowhere. Like a specter, and under the terrified gaze of the surrounding goblins, he sent the elite Goblin Knight flying with a single, massive blow. The knight slammed with incredible force against the cave wall. We see him preparing to deliver the final, decisive blow. He aimed his strike directly at the Goblin Knight's neck. However, just as the dagger was about to reach its target, an invisible force suddenly surged out of the darkness. Seconds later, an imposing and heavy voice echoed through the air. What is happening here? He asked, as he slowly looked up. And there, we see a truly massive figure emerging. From the depths of the lair, the Goblin General finally appeared. He was, without question, the most powerful being in this entire place. My general, you have no idea, but this cursed brat. He has slaughtered so many of our brothers. The low-ranking goblins were all accusing him, calling him a true demon. They were all shouting at once, hoping the general would use his power to execute him. But the general simply made a calm gesture with his hand. He signaled for them all to be quiet, and almost at that exact same moment, a small silhouette appeared right behind him. He noticed a single weak point in the Goblin General's defense. Without hesitating for even a second, he lunged forward for a surprise attack. He aimed a direct slash at the general's neck, but, well, things are rarely that simple. Just at the very instant his blade was about to reach its target, an invisible force suddenly manifested out of thin air. It sent him flying through the air, and that was when the other goblins finally reacted. "How dare you attack the general?" they cried, their faces twisted with rage. The goblins surrounded him completely, ready to tear him apart. However, the general, who was standing just to the side, stopped the confrontation and gave an order to the goblin shaman beside him. "Take them away from here," he commanded, and the shaman began to lead the way. But our protagonist, keeping his gaze sharp and alert, protected his mother by firmly placing her behind him. "Don't worry, we won't do anything to your mother," the shaman promised. "Please, follow me, and bring your mother along with you." And so, we see them move up from the depths of the 5th underground level. Eventually, they arrived at the 2nd underground level to begin their new life. He and his mother settled into a cozy cave, or at least, as cozy as a cave can be. Before leaving, the goblin shaman turned back and asked him for his name. Without giving it much thought, he let those 3 words slip out. Lin Qingfeng. From this moment on, everything would change for him. He had left his childhood behind. Now, he had to learn to contribute to the Wei dynasty. The shaman explained that by patrolling or hunting, he could bring many good things to his mother. To be honest, he didn't listen to a single one of the shaman's grand speeches. But the moment he heard he could provide for his mother, his ears perked up. He became interested immediately, his expression turning quite serious. He asked if it was true, and then, simply like that, he agreed to join. Easily deceived by the goblin shaman's clever tricks, he took the bait. And just like that, he was officially assigned to the patrol team. The following day, he joined the squad and prepared to begin his first fight. An old goblin pointed toward a pile of ancient, rusted weapons. He shouted at the group of goblins standing before him, his voice raspy and loud. "Pick from here. Choose the weapon you like best and the one that feels most comfortable." Everyone else rushed forward, eager to grab the largest and most imposing weapons they could find. But Lin Qingfeng, on the other hand, simply picked up a single dagger with one hand. He left his other hand completely free, which was a rather bold choice for a first-timer. The old goblin issued a stern warning, reminding him that the humans out there are incredibly cunning. However, he simply replied that for him, this small blade would be more than enough. Not long after, we see him following the squad into the heart of a thick, tangled thicket. One of the goblins pulled out a pair of binoculars to scout the area ahead. He stared intently at the humans who, for the moment, were nowhere to be seen. The battle hadn't even begun yet, and the tension in the air was already palpable. And yet, he was already daydreaming about exactly how he would dispose of the loot. The orders were clear. They were to kill all the males without exception. As for the females, they planned to keep them for a bit of fun before finishing them off. A goblin man from the same squad was watching the scene unfold with a cruel eye. Seeing Lin Qingfeng so quiet, he decided to vent his bad mood on his new companion. He spoke up quite loudly on purpose, making sure he was standing right in front of him. He boasted that when they returned, they would all have their way with the elf. He asked the group what they thought, and at the mere mention of an elf, things shifted. The other goblins immediately broke into lecherous grins, their faces twisted with dark anticipation. To be perfectly honest, none of them actually knew where an elf could be found. In that moment, the goblin man turned his gaze toward him with a very deliberate look. "Hey, isn't there an elf hiding in your cave?" he asked with a sneer. "You really should invite your brothers over to enjoy her a little, shouldn't you?" In an instant, the other goblins threw looks at him filled with pure envy and greed. The goblin man fully expected Lin Qingfeng to lose his temper and attack him right then. He was looking for the perfect excuse to finish him off once and for all. But he never imagined, even in his wildest dreams, that without a second of hesitation, our protagonist would simply eliminate the greedy goblin standing right in front of him. Deep down, the goblin man's heart actually filled with a twisted kind of joy. Immediately, he put on a performance, adopting an expression of righteous indignation as he began to scream his accusations at the top of his lungs. "Murdering a comrade is an atrocious crime," he bellowed for everyone to hear. "How dare you do such a thing? I'll send you down to join the other managers." The goblin man certainly didn't expect Lin Qingfeng to be quite so insolent. He was stunned that the newcomer wouldn't show him even the slightest bit of respect. But before he could even finish his threat, things took a very sharp turn. He moved in the blink of an eye, driving his dagger directly into the leader's heart. The order was given, and every goblin in the squad responded to the call for blood at once. But if one of them dared to step forward, that was one more goblin he killed. If they came at him in pairs, he simply annihilated the pair of them together. His body was incredibly agile, and his reflexes were, quite literally, as fast as lightning. In a very short time, we see the goblins falling one after another. Witnessing the massacre, the goblin man finally learned the true meaning of fear. He fell to his knees, begging for forgiveness without stopping for a single breath. Over and over, he repeated that he recognized his mistake, which was a bit late, honestly. But after a long, tense wait, he received no response from Lin Qingfeng. Just when he started to believe that he might actually get away with it, and was already planning how to tell the general to settle the score with him. In the very next second, he felt an icy cold sensation on the top of his head. His entire body was split clean in half, ending his schemes forever. After our protagonist finished massacring the entire horde of goblins, suddenly, he heard something else echoing through the area. It was the sound of incessant footsteps drawing closer and closer. he realized immediately that a group of adventurers was approaching their position. We must remember that in his past life, he was an elite assassin, but he had reincarnated as the most handsome goblin in existence. Yes, really. However, his companions envied him deeply for his unnatural good looks. Because of that, they deliberately isolated him and made his life a living hell. This eventually caused him to reach a point where he could no longer contain his fury. And so, during a mission, he ended up attacking the other members of his group. Now, just as he was preparing to take a moment to rest, we hear the voices of the goblins, and in a very short time, the squad of adventurers finally reaches him. In that instant, everyone looks at him with utter surprise as he stands atop a massive pile. A pile of goblin corpses, to be precise. They can't help but wonder what on earth happened here. What are they so afraid of? After all, to them, he is nothing more than a filthy goblin. They notice the green ears of those goblin corpses are still intact, which is quite a find. To them, this is nothing but money. With a face twisted by greed, the group leader lunges toward him. He is ready for him to leave this world, preparing to deliver what he thinks will be the finishing blow. However, at the exact moment his sword is about to make contact, suddenly, our protagonist's body turns as black as ink. He melts into the shadows of the forest before the leader can even react, which was a clever move, honestly. He reappears right behind him, pressing a dagger as dark as night against the man's neck. Suddenly, a voice echoes from behind, calling out for a defense of sacred light. A fireball follows immediately, and a barrier suddenly envelopes Jido to protect him. And right after that, a massive blaze of fire comes hurtling directly toward our hero. Quickly, he steps onto Jido's back to gain momentum and leaps into the air. He soars over the fireball, and, with a graceful backflip, he lands firmly in the distance, increasing the space between them once again. Once more, he melts away, disappearing completely into the surrounding shadows. The team begins to search everywhere, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of his silhouette. Meanwhile, the mage prepares to cast a tracking spell to find exactly where he is hiding. But he moves first, striking forward with a swift and accurate cut. We see a shadow collide with the young mage, and in the very next instant, the girl collapses to the ground. Immediately after, the cleric also spots a dark silhouette lunging directly toward him. With two quick and lethal slashes, our hero brings the man's life to an end. Before drawing his final breath, he manages to scream a warning to his companions, "Run." At first, the remaining adventurers were determined to avenge their two fallen comrades. But in the blink of an eye, their captain was also lying motionless on the forest floor. The last adventurer left standing takes in the gruesome scene before him. He runs away in a blind panic, desperately trying to escape the shadows of the forest. However, our protagonist has no intention of letting him go, delivering a precise cut right through his neck. In that moment, the familiar and cold voice of the system echoes once again. "Congratulations," it says, "you have successfully eliminated a human." As a reward, he has obtained a significant improvement to his constitution. He looks down at the corpses on the ground, without feeling even the slightest hint of emotion. After looting a decent amount of spoils, he prepares to take these items back to his mother. Not long after, he arrives back at the goblin lair. Seeing him carrying such a large bag all by himself, the other goblins begin to cast strange and suspicious looks his way. They assume, quite wrongly, that his companions have simply excluded him from the group. Suddenly, a goblin intentionally bumps into him, roughly pushing his human slave forward as he does. In any other situation, he surely would have beaten the fellow to a pulp right then and there. But at this particular moment, his hands are a bit too full for such pleasantries. He chooses to ignore the other goblins and their mocking laughter, simply walking past them. Just as he is about to enter the lair, an old goblin named Elder Shandon calls out to stop him. At first, he tries to play dumb, acting as if he hadn't heard a single word. However, the goblin guards at the entrance block his path and point directly toward the elder. He has no choice but to turn around, his brow furrowed in clear annoyance. By now, the one who called him, Elder Shandon, has already scurried over to stand right in front of him. "I just called you," the old man snaps. "Why didn't you stop?" "Were you calling me?" Our hero replies calmly. "I didn't hear anything." He adds that he didn't hear any goblin actually mention his name. Elder Shandon begins to tremble with a sudden, sharp surge of rage. But just as he is about to lash out, Shandon senses a terrifying aura radiating from the young goblin. He feels that if he so much as flinches, his head might very well roll across the floor. He even vaguely senses the overwhelming pressure typical of a high-class goblin. Seeing that Elder Shandon has fallen silent for quite some time, our protagonist begins to lose his patience. "If you don't need anything else," he says, "then I'll be going." "Wait," the elder stammers, gesturing toward the loot he's carrying. "You have to hand over a portion," Shandon insists, pointing to the heavy bag slung over his back. Upon hearing such a bold demand, he finds he simply cannot help himself. Elder Shandon's brow furrows in deep irritation, while our hero only grips his bag tighter. "This is mine," he states flatly. "Why on earth would any of it be yours?" The elder insists that the loot belongs to the lair and to the group as a whole. "How could everything possibly belong to a single goblin like you?" he demands. The other goblins standing around begin to boo and jeer, loudly taking the elder's side. Elder Shandon takes a deep breath and offers a final, stern warning. You should know the rules. Half of all the loot brought here must always be handed over. No one is an exception, and besides, the goblins who went out with you are all dead. Upon hearing this, the goblin leader Don, who had been so arrogant just a moment ago, freezes in his tracks. We see them all staring in confusion, wondering how he could have returned completely unharmed. If they had run into someone powerful, it would be understandable for the whole group to be wiped out. But how is it that you managed to return all by yourself? The leader, Don, asks this pointedly, trying to test him and gauge his reaction. How did they die? And more importantly, how did you survive? I am simply stronger than they were, he replies. Do you really want to test that theory? Sensing the clear threat in those words, the leader Don begins to tremble with a sudden surge of rage. He screams out, calling him a miserable wretch and accusing him of being far too arrogant. Just you wait, he snarls. I am going to report you for this. He claims that before the great goblin general, it will be clear his crime was cooperating with humans. Otherwise, how else could he explain being the only one to make it back alive? Fed up with their nonsense, he simply turned around to walk away. But the goblin leader Don and his men quickly moved to block his path. You wait right here, Don growled, or you come with me to see the great goblin. Our hero already had his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. He was ready to strike at any moment. After all, everyone has their limits. Seeing that this goblin was intent on blocking his way time and time again, he finally lost his patience, drew his dagger, and shouted for him to die. As he approached step by step, the leader Don began to panic. Immediately, he screamed at the low-ranking goblins standing behind him. Catch this brat for me, he yelled, and the other goblins finally reacted. They moved in to surround him, but just as they were closing the circle, he unsheathed his dagger, fully prepared to face them all down. Suddenly, a sharp voice echoed through the air. Stop right there. I will handle this, the voice said, not giving Don a chance to complain. The shaman interrupted him and, speaking directly to our hero, said, Very well. You may leave now. He asked no further questions and simply nodded. He took his bundle and left the scene, feeling quite satisfied with himself. We follow him back to his dark, damp room in the second basement. There, Victoria stares at the blood-stained bag he is carrying in his hand. Her jaw drops, and with a slight tremble, she asks if he has killed someone. He nods without a moment's hesitation. Yes, he tells her. King Feng had taken down many people. Aren't I great? He asks, while raising the blood-stained dagger still in his hand. He waits for his mother to praise him, but to his surprise, she slaps his hand away. Don't touch me, she says. He simply cannot understand what he did wrong. He wonders why she is so angry, but noticing she can't stop staring at the bag, he suddenly empties all of his loot onto the floor. With a face full of pride, he tells her that all of this is for her. He tells her to take whatever she likes, while Victoria feels a wave of pain and sadness. That is, until she spots a pocket watch that seems to hold a photograph. And there, engraved on the surface, are the words, Happy Birthday. In that very instant, she completely breaks down. Seeing her like this, our hero begins to panic, which is only natural, really. He rushes to his mother's side to wipe away her tears. Between her sobs, Victoria asks him one simple question. Why? Why did he have to kill them? Because they wanted to kill King Feng, he explains. What? Someone wanted to kill you? She gasps in shock. Are you alright? Victoria's tone shifts instantly to one of pure anguish. She hugs him and checks him over carefully. No, I'm very strong, he insists. Mom, he asks, do you not want me to kill people anymore? If your mother tells you not to kill anymore, she asks him, would you listen to me? Of course, he replies. If mom tells me not to kill, then I won't kill. But what happens if those people want to hurt you? She wonders aloud. He pauses, trying to process the scenario, and decides that if she says no, then nothing happens. He can simply run away. After all, he tells her, he is actually quite an expert at playing hide and seek. Looking at him there, so innocent and without understanding a thing, Victoria is struck by a sudden realization. For the first time, she truly understands just how vital his education is going to be. After a long moment of silence, she looks at him and speaks with absolute seriousness. She explains that while she doesn't want him killing people, she won't stop him if someone tries to kill him first. I only hope, she says softly, that you will at least give them a chance. He lets out a laugh of relief, and the next morning, after finishing breakfast, he prepares to head out as usual. We see that today, he has been assigned once again to a reconnaissance group. Unlike yesterday, when they mocked him and took advantage of him, this time no one dares to bother him. By listening to the goblins' conversations, he had already built a mental map of this massive lair, preparing for the future, for the day when he would have to finish off all these goblins and finally escape with his mother. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the Sunyun forest, a group of adventurers moves cautiously through the dense trees. And right at that moment, a group of goblins suddenly leaps down from the branches above. It was, as fate would have it, his own squad. Seeing the goblins, the adventurers immediately draw their weapons to fight. But our hero doesn't join the fray. Instead, he simply watches the chaos unfold from the safety of a tree. He waits patiently, watching until both sides are heavily wounded and exhausted. It was then that he remembered his promise, and yet, he suddenly attacked, annihilating the remaining humans and goblins alike. With this decisive move, he managed to obtain 2 more talents. The first was the primal beast instinct of the goblins. The second was human perception. In that instant, he sensed that one human was still clinging to life on the ground. He fully intended to finish him off with his dagger, but then he suddenly remembered his mother's words. So, he sheathed his blade and turned around to return to the goblin cave. What he didn't know, however, was that his habit of returning alone had sparked deep resentment among the other goblins. We must remember he was reborn in this lair as the most handsome and capable of them all, which rarely helps one make friends. Shortly after his birth, he had used his sheer strength to force his way into a mid-rank goblin squad. And just now, they had headed out once again to hunt as a group. However, this time, Morrow was once again the only one to return. This immediately provoked the anger and suspicion of the rest of the tribe. At that moment, a goblin clad in heavy armor made his appearance. He approached slowly and introduced himself as Knight Lee. He commanded Morrow to follow him, explaining that the general wanted a word. The surrounding goblins began to whisper among themselves, their voices filled with spite. They thought, with more than a little malice, that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. They assumed the general wanted to interrogate him personally for his suspicious behavior. However, faced with the goblin knight's summons, Morrow simply looked at him with disdain and turned to walk away. For him, after all, nothing in this world is more important than seeing his mother again. You, how dare you ignore me? And how dare you ignore the general's orders? Furious, the goblin knight lunged at him with everything he had. He was determined to seize him and drag him before the general. But Morrow didn't even bother to turn around. He stopped the attack with a single hand. This left Knight Lee completely stunned, as one might expect. In that moment, the goblin knight began to struggle desperately. He tried to free his wrist, which Morrow held in a firm, unbreakable grip. But it was impossible to break loose, so, with a roar, he attacked with his other hand. Morrow simply arched an eyebrow and sent him flying backward. Every goblin present stood there with their mouths hanging open in disbelief. A second later, Knight Lee scrambled to his feet and let out a furious roar. Feeling utterly humiliated, he no longer cared about the general's orders. Now, he only wanted to tear Morrow into pieces. But just as he was about to launch himself forward once again, a deep and solemn voice suddenly echoed through the air. Stand down. Upon hearing that voice, Knight Lee stopped dead in his tracks. Morrow also turned toward the sound of the voice to see who it was. And there we see a massive, burly goblin slowly emerging from the shadows. It was the goblin general, and from him emanated an invisible aura of pure power. It was a presence so heavy that the other goblins didn't even dare to look him in the eye. Immediately, every goblin in the vicinity scrambled to bow deeply before their general. And then, the goblin general began to walk slowly toward Morrow. He was clearly trying to intimidate him, and Morrow, for his part, tensed every muscle in his body. He was ready to strike at any moment, but the goblin general only observed him for a brief second. Then, he simply turned around and told him to follow, beginning to walk away. He didn't even look back as he walked, but seeing that Morrow remained still and refused to follow, he stopped and added that if Morrow didn't want his mother to die, he had better start obeying. Those words acted like a sudden, violent trigger. Morrow's figure vanished in an instant, moving faster than the eye could follow. A second later, he already had his dagger drawn and ready. He was aiming directly for the goblin general's heart. However, the dagger stopped just inches above the general's chest. It was as if an invisible wall prevented it from advancing even a single centimeter further. Deep down, Morrow knew this was the perfect opportunity he had been searching for. But the goblin general didn't even bother to turn around and face him. He simply caught the blade of the dagger between two of his fingers. He remarked that his technique wasn't bad and wondered how his vision had improved so much so quickly. Morrow threatened to kill him, but the general simply challenged him to try if he thought he could. He asked if he was truly capable, and with that, the goblin general casually flicked a finger. And with that minimal force from just the tip of his finger, it was more than enough to send Morrow flying backward. He didn't stop until he had tumbled across the ground several times. In that moment, the general's voice echoed through the air once more. He warned that if Morrow didn't want anything to happen to his mother, he should follow without a word, and this time, Morrow followed without hesitation. We see them arrive at the very top floor of the massive goblin nest. Standing right on the stairs that led up to the castle, Morrow noticed that everything around him was covered in beautiful, vibrant flowers. Immediately, he couldn't help but think that if his mother were there, she would surely love a place like this. Out of pure curiosity, he leaned down and plucked one, causing Janer Agawain to frown beside him. When the general saw Morrow preparing to pull up a second flower, Janer Agawain finally lost his patience and spoke up. He told him to stop, explaining that these things didn't actually belong to him. Someone else had planted them, but Morrow acted as if he hadn't heard a word. He simply kept picking them, one after another, without a care in the world. Eventually, Janer Agawain reached his breaking point. Suddenly, he delivered a sharp punch right to the top of Morrow's head. That finally stopped him, though by then, he had a massive bump to show for it. I told you not to pull them up, he snapped, while Morrow rubbed his head, feeling quite indignant. If only he had the strength to win, he surely would have attacked the general by now. Seeing just how much the boy seemed to like those flowers, the goblin general suddenly decided to make him a little proposal. If he wanted to take those flowers with him, he simply had to land a single blow on the general. Having said that, he looked down at Morrow with a very serious expression, arms crossed. I don't want to, Morrow replied, knowing full well the man was much stronger than him. It seemed our young protagonist wasn't interested in fighting battles, he wasn't sure he could win. At that exact moment, the Goblin Knight who had been bothering him earlier, a fellow named Lee, came running up, and a light bulb went off in Janer Agawayn's head. And so, without warning, the general pointed directly at the Goblin Knight. If Morrow could defeat him instead, that would also be enough to earn the flowers. General, sir, don't you think this is a bit wrong? Lee asked, sounding concerned. He wondered aloud if this wasn't just bullying a fellow goblin, though he was clearly lying through his teeth. His eyes were actually sparkling with excitement, as he had wanted to teach Morrow a lesson for quite some time. He thought to himself that if the general weren't standing right there, that insolent brat would have been attacked long ago. In that very moment, a strange glint flashed within Janer Agawayn's eyes. Immediately, a glowing panel manifested right in front of him. On it, all the personal data and stats of the Goblin Knight Lee were clearly recorded. And there it was, his overall power. It stood in stark contrast to the standard data of the Goblin Knight Lee. Our protagonist's stats, when compared to those of a goblin who has only just moved past the initial growth stage, appeared to be extremely anomalous. Every time he ventured out, the boy's attributes seemed to increase. It was truly fascinating, as an ordinary creature usually needs a great deal of time to increase their power. Normally, one would need to endure a very long period of intense training. But this boy, in just a matter of a few days, had traveled a path that typically takes others several years to complete. To put that strength to the test, Janer Agawayn ordered Morrow to face off against a goblin. He was to face one of the 7 forces in direct combat. The moment the start was announced, the Goblin Knight lunged, though he certainly wasn't looking to be friends. But Morrow didn't show even a hint of panic. He simply stepped back and dodged the incoming blade. Then, he raised his hand and, aiming directly at the Goblin Knight, he unleashed a massive fireball. However, when that sphere of flames struck the Goblin Knight's armor with perfect precision, it barely left a faint scorch mark. It didn't actually cause even the slightest bit of damage to the Goblin Knight. It was useless, really, as the Goblin Knight's specialized armor is capable of nullifying the vast majority of magical attacks. Seeing this, the Goblin Knight simply smiled with utter disdain. And so, he lunged back into the attack. Even though Morrow managed to block the blow with his arm, the sheer force of the impact was immense. It still sent him flying through the air. And while our protagonist was being hurled backward, the Goblin Knight leaped high into the sky. He fully intended to finish him off, but he never imagined that, in the very next instant, a fireball would slam directly into his face. To be honest, the fireball itself didn't cause him any real physical damage. But even so, something felt wrong. He could sense a sudden aura of danger. Because of that instinct, he stopped his attack instantly and threw himself to the side. Thanks to that quick reflex, he managed to dodge, by a hair, the dagger that came flying from behind the flames. In that moment, the knight felt a genuine shiver of panic. If he hadn't dodged in time, he would likely be pushing up daisies by now. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a momentary lapse in concentration. He vowed it wouldn't happen again, but before the Goblin Knight could even finish that thought, he realized that Morrow had completely vanished from his sight. It gave him quite a scare. He began searching everywhere, wondering where the boy could have gone. He stood there in stunned silence, unable to find the words, but the Goblin General watching from the side narrowed his eyes. The General saw it very clearly. Morrow had used the knight's blind spots to move at high speed. He had successfully achieved his goal of hiding in plain sight. That kind of technique isn't something one learns overnight. It takes years of practice. And yet, here we have a boy who had only just been born into this world. Something so utterly illogical caused the Goblin General to frown instantly. No matter how much he thought about it, he simply couldn't understand why. Meanwhile, the battle continued to rage on. The Goblin Knight could sense the danger lurking nearby, but being unable to find Morrow was driving him to the very brink of despair. He could only roar in fury, wondering what kind of trick this hiding business was. If he had any guts, he should come out and fight like a man. And in the very next instant, Morrow appeared right behind the Goblin Knight. By the time the Goblin Knight finally realized he was there, it was already too late. Just as the dagger was about to sink in, the Goblin General himself intervened to protect the knight's body. In the blink of an eye, he appeared right in front of our protagonist, and using only a single hand, he stopped the attack without any effort at all. Enough, it's over. The general had stepped in specifically to stop him. In that moment, the Goblin Knight shoved Morrow away with a rough push. He screamed at him, promising that he would pay for this humiliation. He swore he'd make him pay, but Morrow didn't pay any attention to his shouting. Instead, he looked at the general, noting that the knight wasn't dead yet. Seeing that the boy truly intended to finish him off, the Goblin Knight flew into a rage just as he was being forced to leave. And as the Goblin Knight was leaving, he suddenly realized that you had vanished once again. In the very next second, we see Morrow reappear right behind his back. And there, on the knight's neck, he left a very shallow, deliberate wound. Feeling utterly humiliated, the Goblin Knight could hardly contain himself. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he was going to tear you to pieces. But the Goblin General shouted back, ordering him to retreat immediately. Even in his rage, the Goblin Knight didn't dare to disobey the General's direct orders. Before finally withdrawing, he shot Morrow one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred. However, he failed to notice that the blood trickling down from his neck, which should have been normal, seemed to be mixed with something else entirely. Once the Goblin Knight had finally moved away, a tense silence fell over the clearing. The General finally spoke, asking Morrow why he hadn't stopped when the fight was clearly over. Did he truly intend to finish him off? Morrow simply wondered why he should have stopped at all. He asked what was so wrong with killing him, as if winning a fight meant anything less. Is it only over when someone dies? The General asked if that was his way of surviving. Morrow didn't quite understand the question. He only knew what it took to stay alive. To him, it was simple. He had to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his existence. Hearing those words, which were so chillingly out of place for a boy his age, the Goblin General could only let out a long, heavy sigh of resignation. Then, with a weary gesture of his hand, he signaled for the encounter to end. Go on, get out of here, the General said, telling him to take the flower he had gathered. But he added that, starting tomorrow, Morrow would have to come see him every single day. He intended to teach the boy what true combat techniques actually looked like. The reason was simple enough. The General was already incredibly powerful. He pointed out that what Morrow was using were merely assassination techniques. It wasn't real combat, and besides, those methods of his were far too dangerous. He demanded Morrow give up assassination entirely, wondering who on earth had taught him to fight that way. It was as if the boy didn't value his own life in the slightest. Morrow replied that his mother had taught him, though he didn't clarify exactly who he meant. Deep down, he was thinking of the woman from his past life, whom he called Mother. The Goblin General narrowed his eyes, sensing there was more to the story. He asked again if Morrow would come, regardless of whether he actually wanted to or not. To be honest, Morrow hated the idea of spending time with this giant brute. The only thing he truly wanted was to go back home to his mother. And so, with a touch of stubbornness, he finally shot back a response. He asked the General who he thought he was to claim that Morrow didn't know how to fight. The General simply replied that he was the stronger one, challenging the boy to prove him wrong. Half an hour later, we see Morrow sprawled on the ground, gasping for breath. In a fit of rage, he shouted up at the towering Goblin General. He swore that, one day, he would finally find a way to defeat him. We'll see if that's true, the General replied. Try it whenever you like. He promised to be ready for the boy whenever he finally decided to make his move. But before that could happen, he told Morrow he needed to get stronger by any means necessary. With those final words, the Goblin General turned and marched away without a single backward glance. Morrow rested on the ground for a moment, but just as he prepared to stand up, his legs suddenly buckled beneath him, and he collapsed right back onto the dirt. The previous battle had clearly consumed every last drop of his energy. Deep down, he was worried that if he didn't hurry back, his mother would start to fret. At that thought, he forced his exhausted body to try and stand once more. But his legs failed him again, and he began to plummet toward the earth. However, this time, he didn't hit the hard ground. He landed on something remarkably soft. In that moment, he noticed a fragrance that was quite different from his mother's scent. If you're hurt, you really should stay still and rest, a gentle voice told him. The woman sighed, wondering how Tian could be so cruel to such a small child. She noted that if this happened among humans, it would be considered child abuse, and she wasn't wrong. Morrow asked who she was, and she introduced herself simply as Elena. She revealed she was Tian's wife, and then, she self-consciously touched the scar on her face. She apologized, asking the boy if he thought she looked very ugly. She worried she might have scared him, but suddenly, Morrow remembered something important. With a great deal of effort, he pulled himself away from Elena's arms. I have to go now, Morrow insisted. My mother is waiting for me. He felt he couldn't stay, but Elena pointed out that he was still far too injured to move. How about I heal those wounds of yours before you head out, she suggested gently. He asked if it would take long, only to see Elena shake her head in reassurance. Our young hero hesitated for a moment, but ultimately, he decided to trust her. We see Elena pulling several medicines out of her storage ring with practiced ease. He caught the scent of the herbs. It certainly wasn't poison, which was a relief. For some reason, toward this woman he had only just met, he felt a strange, inexplicable sense of comfort. As Elena tended to his wounds, she began to explain a few things to him. Healing magic, she noted, generally draws upon one's own life force to work. It is a type of magic that functions by rapidly accelerating cellular metabolism. Every magic has its price, and using healing spells during combat is always a last resort. However, if one has enough time after the battle has concluded, and if the injury isn't severe, it is better to use medicines as a support. In the end, it is often best to trust in your body's own natural recovery. Morrow nodded his head, looking a bit dazed, as if he barely understood the technicalities. Seeing his confused expression, Elena couldn't help but let out a soft laugh. By the time he finally made his way out of the Goblin General's castle, it was already very late at night as he descended toward the entrance of the lair. Suddenly, the elderly goblin called out to stop him. You haven't taken your things yet, he grumbled. If you don't want them, I'll just throw them away. With a heavy thud, the old goblin kicked a sack lying at his feet. Inside was all the loot Morrow had managed to collect throughout the day. He picked up the bag and headed off to trade with the other goblins. But just as he was about to enter the depths of the lair, a small sparrow goblin, who had been hiding in the shadows, suddenly bolted toward him. Just as the little creature tried to reach him, it was intercepted by a patrolling goblin. "And where did you come from, little one?" the guard demanded. The small creature didn't answer. It seemed he hadn't quite learned how to speak yet. He simply squirmed and struggled, desperate to follow after Morrow. Our hero, of course, had been aware of the little one's presence for quite some time. He chose to ignore it, focusing instead on exchanging his loot for a few goblin shells. He purchased some fruit and other food to take back home to his mother. To his surprise, he even found several cups of instant noodles among the wares. Since the goblins had absolutely no idea how to eat such a thing, the price was incredibly low, so, naturally, he decided to take several of them. Paying no mind to the tiny goblin still being held back by the patrol, he simply walked through the iron gate and continued on his way. And so, he finally arrived at the lair on the second level. As the door swung open, a familiar, comforting scent greeted him. He called out, letting his mother know that he had finally returned home. The words had barely left his lips when Victoria came running from the back of the room. Seeing him covered in wounds, his mother, deeply worried, immediately began to check him over. And so, he sat down and told his mother everything that had happened to him that day. He still had no idea what the Goblin General's true purpose was in training him. But at the very least, he could be certain the General had no intention of actually harming him. Meanwhile, back in the Goblin Nest Tavern, a Goblin Knight stands tall and proud. He was busy boasting to the others about how he had taught our hero a lesson. Suddenly, and quite messily, he begins to cough up thick, black blood. Immediately after, he loses consciousness entirely and collapses onto the floor. And right then, the familiar voice of the system resonates in Morrow's ear. "Congratulations," it says, "you have officially defeated a goblin. His faction has now obtained the wild instinct trait. Furthermore, he has earned a special evolution point for his efforts. Soon, thanks to his excellent performance over the last few days, he receives a generous reward. He no longer has to rely on those crude, improvised weapons from before." An assistant steps forward to help him choose his new equipment. Seeing such a well-equipped arsenal laid out before him, he finds himself completely dazzled. Until, eventually, his gaze fixes upon a pile of black gunpowder sitting in the corner. Immediately, his heart leaps with a sudden surge of joy. This is a treasure that is usually quite difficult to find, to say the least. He wonders if, by preparing enough black powder, he might finally be able to finish off that so-called the Goblin General and actually eliminate him. He silently memorizes its location, already planning to return for it later. After that, he continues his inspection of the other weapons. At that moment, his attention is drawn toward a particular bow. It looks ancient, yet the body of the bow is as sharp as the blade of a sword. He is very satisfied with what he sees. After all, in the art of assassination, stealth and precision are the only things that truly matter. Just then, we hear the characteristic cry of the goblins echoing nearby. And so, he turns around to meet his new teammates for the first time. We see a goblin who is missing an ear. He stands there, looking quite lost in his own thoughts. Meanwhile, another goblin, who is clutching a staff, comes running toward him. "Lord King Foam." "Hello," she says, "I am your partner for this mission. My name is Gobu Junsha." Gobu Junsha extends her hand, but he barely spares her a glance. His gaze, instead, settles on the one approaching them slowly. It is Goblin Shangdong, who tells them, "Good, if you have your weapons, follow me. This time, I, a high-ranking goblin, will be your guide. And also your captain. My name is Goblin Shangdong, and you should consider yourselves lucky. Today, I am going to take you out to see the world. We are going to our very own goblin arsenal." But Goblin Shangdong hadn't even finished speaking yet, when he was interrupted by a goblin of truly enormous size. "I only want to hit people," he says, looking at the big guy in front of him. Goblin Shangdong let out a mocking little laugh. "What a pity. Our mission today isn't about hitting anyone. If you aren't going to obey, you can just get lost." Upon hearing the words of Goblin Shangdong, the large goblin didn't hesitate and turned around to leave. But he didn't expect that Shangdong's next words would leave him rooted to the spot. "If you don't obey my orders, then you're out of the great goblin nest." It is an order directly from the Goblin General. At any other time, to be perfectly honest, Goblin Shangdong wouldn't have bothered with these low-level goblins at all. But, since it was an order from the Goblin General himself, he had no choice but to obey. Everyone followed Goblin Shangdong until they reached a medium-sized goblin nest. We can see right away that this place was quite different from the Great Goblin Nest. The moment they stepped inside, a sudden blast of hot air hit them right in the face. And there, they saw a goblin who was actually busy forging metal. This place serves as the official goblin arsenal. It is the site responsible for the manufacturing of all their weaponry. Almost every single one of our weapons is produced right here. But his gaze drifted toward a group of women who had recently been captured. One of them, strangely enough, looked particularly familiar to him. The large goblin in the group noticed this scene unfolding. He grew pensive, wondering why they were wasting their valuable resources. Why spend time doing these things that seemed, to him, utterly useless? Wouldn't it be faster to simply steal weapons from those adventurers? And easier too? After all, the Great Nest was already full of stolen gear. He couldn't see why they had to go through the trouble of making them. The large goblin didn't understand the logic behind it at all. He felt that in the time it took to forge, they could have killed more humans. That way, they could have cleared them out of this forest once and for all. But upon hearing this, Goblin Shandong simply shook his head. The enro says that we cannot always depend on others for what we need. If we are to dominate the world, we cannot always depend on others. The large goblin in the group watched this scene unfold, and he remained lost in thought. Why spend time doing these things that seemed, to him, utterly useless? He felt that way they could clear the humans from this forest once and for all, rather than relying on others. The enro says we must stop being dependent, and the general wants us to stop relying on the weapons of those adventurers. Besides, we have to consider the weapons we've been stealing from the adventurers all this time. The majority of them are custom-made specifically for humans. To be perfectly honest, they are of no use to us whatsoever. For the goblins, the general wants us to forge weapons that are designed only for our own kind. Goblin Shandong didn't understand the logic at all, yet he chose not to contradict Goblin Xia. After all, this fellow had been personally named by the Goblin General himself, and later, he was handpicked to join this specific elite squad. He is definitely no ordinary soldier. Just then, a thunderous laugh suddenly echoed through the cave. A burly goblin, wielding a massive iron hammer, began to approach them slowly. He told them they had guessed half the truth before offering a boisterous greeting to everyone. He introduced himself as Goblin Hammer, the one in charge of the entire arsenal. He told them that simply calling him Hammer would be more than enough. Upon seeing the peculiar group standing before him, Goblin Hammer let a slight smile play across his face. Forming such an interesting team, so out of the blue, was certainly an unusual move. He couldn't help but wonder what the Goblin General was actually planning this time. Hammer was just about to tell them to head to their quarters to get some much-needed rest. Suddenly, blood-curdling screams coming from the entrance caught everyone's attention. As it turns out, it was a group of women the goblins had captured and brought back to the lair. They were huddled together, their eyes filled with nothing but pure fear and desperation. Among them, a familiar figure immediately caught his eye. It was Cress, the woman who had been handed over to his enemy. What on earth was she doing here? Just then, Chair Goblin suddenly let out a shout. He lunged forward, throwing himself at the goblin holding the rope. He accused Yasuo of trying to steal their hard-earned loot. The goblin holding the rope, seeing such audacity, kicked Chair Goblin with all his might. The blow landed squarely in his abdomen, sending Chair Goblin flying through the air until he hit the ground. As he watched him struggle to get back up, the other goblin prepared to stomp on his head. He told him to stop right there, noting that before hitting a dog, one should check who the owner is. He explained that hurting the people he brought in only served to make him look ridiculous. And as for Chair Goblin, he was warned not to pounce on every woman he saw. If he wanted one so badly, he should go out and capture her himself. This was their loot, and they intended to enjoy it first. It was their right, after all, or he could simply wait until they grew tired of them. The group of goblins burst into laughter and prepared to make their exit. But Chair Goblin wasn't finished, and he struggled to his feet once more. And then, he reached out and grabbed the low-ranking goblin's hand. Seeing that the little goblin insisted over and over again on taking what belonged to them, the low-ranking goblin finally lost his temper completely. He delivered a sharp slap to his face, yet Chair Goblin held on tight, refusing to let go. At that moment, Goblin Shandong was just about to step in and mediate the situation. That was when the other warned him that he had better take a very good look. He insisted it was this one who was trying to steal what was rightfully theirs. He reminded him that the general had declared the property of 4 people to be sacred. So, even if he killed him right then and there, nothing would happen to Shandong. And so, the other low-ranking goblins began to close in on the scene. They began to beat and kick Chair Goblin without a shred of mercy. We can see that his face was already swollen and badly bruised from the assault. Even so, he still tried to turn his head just so he could be seen. With that hideous goblin skin, his appearance only managed to provoke more disgust. One of the low-ranking goblins, seeing he wouldn't learn his lesson, brandished a long sword. It truly looked as though he was about to deliver the final, fatal blow. Chair Goblin even allowed a small smile of relief to cross his face, a strange reaction, indeed. But the death blow they were all expecting never actually arrived. A large, powerful hand suddenly intervened, stopping the blade right in front of him. He noted that while the little goblin was weak, he possessed a rare kind of courage. The other backed off as he was told to drop the weapon and asked how he dared point it at his own kind. If you have that much energy to spare, he told them, you'd better use it to kill a few humans instead. The other snapped back, demanding to know who the hell he was and who he thought he was to lecture him. He called on his brothers to attack, and the low-ranking goblin lunged at the great goblin with a roar. But the great goblin simply threw a single, effortless punch. And just like that, the low-ranking goblin went flying, crashing violently against the hard ground. As we see the others witness this display of power, the remaining goblins froze. They swallowed hard, stammering that he couldn't just do that. They argued that the little one had broken the rules by trying to steal what belonged to them. The great goblin dismissed them, suggesting they simply give him a woman and be done with it. After all, they had plenty to spare, though the low-ranking goblins still wanted to talk back. However, the great goblin silenced him instantly with a single murderous glare. And so, after this rather tense dialogue, they managed to obtain a girl of about 13 or 14. But just as the low-ranking goblins were preparing to leave the scene, the apprentice goblin Shui, who hadn't uttered a single word until now, stepped aside. Goblin Tai finally spoke up, asking if they hadn't noticed just how many of them there were. How on earth was a single woman going to be enough for everyone? The low-ranking goblins didn't dare cross Goblin Ta, given the circumstances. So, they reluctantly left behind 4 more women. Goblin Chong Dong took one of the women into his arms. And then, guided by Goblin Ta, they all made their way into the room. Meanwhile, we see Sewer Goblin still lying there on the ground. He stared fixedly at Tien, tears streaming uncontrollably from his eyes. At that exact moment, a timid voice interrupted his dark thoughts. A young woman had approached him, her presence a quiet contrast to the violence. She wanted to comfort him, and so Sewer Goblin tried to pick himself up, but his strength failed him, and his legs buckled instantly. Fortunately, the great goblin was there to catch him before he fell. He helped him walk, showing a surprising amount of care for his companion. I don't understand a word you're saying, he told him, but you truly are a strange one. How is it even possible that you don't speak the goblin language? Seeing the great goblin acting so nonchalant, he couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. It seemed that, even among goblins, there were good ones and bad ones after all. Then, his gaze happened to fall upon the woman standing beside the great goblin. What, is one not enough for you? The great goblin asked with a smirk. Do you want her to? Sewer Goblin simply stood there, stunned into silence for a few seconds. This hesitation led the great goblin to assume that he didn't actually want her. But then, to our absolute surprise, in the very next second, the great goblin raised his weapon and, without a second thought, killed the woman. As Sewer Goblin witnessed this horrific scene unfold before him, his eyes went wide, his expression a haunting mixture of pure panic and rising fury. But the great goblin didn't seem to care in the slightest about what he had just done. He simply muttered with a look of pure disgust, "How revolting! I don't even know why those other goblins bother bringing these humans along. They should just kill them all and be done with it. Every single human who tries to invade. This is our goblin territory, after all. They all have to die. Don't you agree?" And as he was saying this, the great goblin, he prepared to reach out and place a hand on his companion. Sewer Goblin, witnessing this entire scene, felt something snap and his eyes flew wide. He threw his hands up and let out a roar that was absolutely brimming with fury. "Ah, so you did want her. Why didn't you just say so before? But really, it's no big deal." Sewer Goblin, however, felt very differently. Realizing there was simply no way to reason with this great goblin, he grabbed the girl who was still in shock and turned around to enter his room. Meanwhile, we see Goblin Tetsu pointing toward the room marked with the name Linji, and he told him quite simply, "This is your room." He nodded and stepped inside, where a woman in a long dress was waiting. She was standing right by the door, trembling visibly from head to toe. With her head bowed low, he barely even spared her a passing glance. Without a moment's hesitation, he slammed the door shut. And there stood Vidona, left completely stunned in front of the closed door. Was it possible? Could she actually escape? With that thought in mind, Vidona crept stealthily away from the door. She began making her way toward the entrance of the lair, hoping for a miracle. She was incredibly lucky, to be honest, not to run into a single goblin along the path. But just at that moment, a soul-piercing scream echoed from the distance. It was her traveling companion, one of the women those low-level goblins had captured earlier. We see her take a hidden peek, her heart pounding against her ribs. And in that instant, she found herself completely paralyzed where she stood. Inside the room, she saw several corpses mutilated in an unimaginably cruel fashion. And the only person left alive in that horrific chamber was her friend, who was currently being surrounded and humiliated by several goblins. At that very moment, her friend seemed to catch sight of something. Her eyes flew wide as saucers, and staring fixedly toward the door, she began to scream in utter desperation. But because she had something stuffed into her mouth, she couldn't make a single audible sound, no matter how hard she tried. Even so, the commotion managed to catch the attention of the nearby goblins. When Vidona realized the goblins were looking right at her, she spun around and bolted. However, a pair of hands suddenly reached out from behind her. They seized her by the neck and hoisted her into the air in a single, terrifying instant. Although goblins are somewhat savage by their very nature, you aren't like them. You don't let yourself be swayed by women. After intentionally letting the woman who was assigned to serve you escape, you slowly open your eyes, and you speak to the empty room. "Come out of there." The very next second, Chris stepped out from a corner with a grin from ear to ear. "Ha ha ha ha. It's impossible to hide anything from you, Master. Master, to be perfectly honest with you, I came here to destroy this place. You wouldn't happen to have some information around here, would you? Maps or things of that nature. Of course, that would be wonderful. If someone as strong as you were to help me, I would be willing to give you half of the reward from my mission." He would hand it over to you. "You've been in a goblin nest since the moment you were born. In your past life, you were merely an assassin who worked himself to death. All for his mother. You don't have the slightest idea what a mission reward even is." Seeing you frown in complete confusion, Chris mistakenly thought that you were not satisfied with the deal. "How about this? A 60-40 split. 70 for you and 30 for me. I can't give you any more. 80-20. I really can't lower my share any further than that. In that moment, Chris wanted to cry, but the tears simply wouldn't come. What he didn't know, of course, was that you had no idea what he was talking about. The moment he opened his mouth, Chris assumed that he had already accepted the deal. And so, without wasting a second, he shared the details of his mission with him. My mission is to obtain a map of this place, Chris explained. And if we can investigate the history while we're at it, I'll handle that too. And considering the state of the garrison, that would be even better. The reward for the mission was a staggering 1,000 gold coins. To give us an idea of the scale, just 3 gold coins are already enough to cover a common person's salary for an entire month. And yet, simply by drawing a map, he could obtain such a generous reward. It was a real bargain, though, naturally, the difficulty of the mission was also incredibly high. As everyone knows, goblins are not exactly known for their hospitality. They are the kind of monsters that love to attack with reckless, wild abandon. But to him, none of that mattered in the slightest. Despite the value of 1,000 gold coins, he felt that a weapon would be far more useful. With that thought in mind, he fixed his gaze on the ring Chris was wearing on his hand. He could feel it, a vague and mysterious fluctuation of power emanating from the ring. It was remarkably similar to the mysterious force dwelling deep within himself. Noticing that intense stare, Chris quickly tightened his hand over the ring. Not this one. This is a very valuable spatial ring, he stammered. The ring, as it turned out, could store 3 cubic meters of energy. He explained that it could even be used to launch an attack, and out in the world, it was worth well over 1,000 gold coins. Our protagonist simply stood there, staring at him fixedly, without saying a single word. That silent, heavy gaze put an enormous amount of pressure on poor Chris. Deep down, he was terrified that if the man got angry, he might just decide to get rid of him entirely. In the end, Chris had no other choice but to take off the ring and hand it over with a look of pure resignation. He took the ring and began to inspect it with a great deal of curiosity. By infusing this little gadget with his own magic power, he found that, incredibly, he could pull objects out or put them back in at will. For a brief moment, he actually seemed to be having the time of his life just playing with it. But right at that moment, a sudden knock was heard at the door. He and Chris exchanged a quick look, and immediately, Chris activated an ability to turn himself invisible. A voice from outside called out, asking if that fellow Kingfin had already gone to sleep. He clenched his fist and opened the door to find Goblin Tai and Vidona standing there. Goblin Tai gave Vidona a shove, pushing her forward from where she had been standing at his side. He claimed he had helped catch the slave and was simply bringing her back where she belonged. When he replied that he didn't have any slaves, Goblin Tai narrowed his eyes suspiciously. To the goblin, this meant that the woman really had been kicked out for good. He remarked that he never expected to find a goblin who wasn't interested in women, which, to be honest, was a fair observation. Just as he was preparing to slam the door shut in their faces, he suddenly felt someone reach out and grab him firmly by the wrist. He looked up, only to find Vidona's face completely drenched in tears. She begged him, pleading for him to please save her. Poor Vidona knew all too well what would happen to her if Goblin Tai took her back. Faced with her plight, he simply pulled away from her grasp without showing a single spark of emotion. Seeing this, she let out a cry of pure, absolute desperation. She promised that in the future, she would do anything, absolutely anything, he asked of her. But he said no, and upon hearing that flat refusal, Vidona lost every shred of hope for her own survival. As they began to lead her away, she wept, whispering quietly to herself. She murmured that if she had only known, she never would have accepted it. She mentioned the mission from that elf, and hearing her speak of an elf that sounded familiar, he froze for a split second before quickly telling Goblin Tai to wait. He declared that he wanted her after all, and before the Iron Goblin could even react, he pulled Vidona inside and brought her straight into the room. The Iron Goblin clearly wanted to say something about this sudden change of heart, but in the end, he simply shook his head in resignation and walked away. And so we see Vidona, who by a sudden stroke of luck, was allowed to stay. She stared at him fixedly, her face a mask of utter bewilderment. To be honest, she hadn't expected him to change his mind so abruptly. Seeing that he wouldn't take his eyes off her for even a second, she slowly, hesitantly, began to take off her clothes. "It's my first time," she whispered, "so please, be gentle with me." In that moment, he could only stare at her with a look of total confusion. He had only let her stay for one reason, because she had just mentioned the elves. And as it happens, his own mother appeared to be an elf as well, just as Vidona was down to nothing but her undergarments. Chris, who had been hiding in the shadows, finally couldn't help himself and spoke up. At that instant, we see Chris covering his eyes, looking utterly embarrassed. He politely warned Vidona to wait just a moment before going any further. "Hey, if you're going to do your dirty business, at least wait until I leave," he grumbled. After saying that, Chris used his Ingni technique and vanished into thin air. It was only then that he finally spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "A moment ago, what was that you said about receiving a mission from the elves?" Hearing those words, the realization finally dawned on Vidona. So, the big boss had only let her stay because he was interested in her information. Without wasting a second, she began to tell him the whole truth. She explained that the reason she had entered this forest in the first place was because she had accepted a mission posted by a specific team. A team made up entirely of elves, and the objective of their mission was to find an elf by the name of Victoria. Are you absolutely certain that is her name? He asked. Vidona nodded desperately, and seeing this, he simply gave her a look of complete indifference. You can stay here, he told her. I don't think any goblins will enter this place. And with that, he turned and walked out of the room. He couldn't help but wonder, could that group of elves actually be looking for his mother? Perhaps they were her companions. He considered for a moment if he should tell her. Probably not, he decided, but he still wondered what this palace had to do with the legends. He knew that, one way or another, his name and reputation would eventually catch up with him. It was as if the very universe was conspiring to keep things interesting and slightly enchanting. The thoughts swirling in his head were a chaotic mix, almost like a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. He moved through the darkness, always clicking into that focused state he knew so well. If he had stayed in that room, he might have let a smile slip, remembering things from the past year. He had to stay calm, even if the situation with Fiona and the others was starting to escalate. It felt as if a new devil had emerged this month, testing the fury he kept repressed deep inside. We're about to go hunting. Do you want to come? I'm quite good at this, the goblin boo boasted. The shadow beneath the goblin began to distort, and he stood tall with a smug, boastful expression. He bragged about his shadow's ability to hide, unaware that his arrogance was a dangerous game. Our protagonist glanced at Boo and the low-level goblins, deciding that killing them all was a waste of time. So, he simply ignored the goblin and walked away, while Boo followed behind, still trying to impress him. Wait, you should come with us. It's full of adventurers out there, Boo shouted, but he was ignored again. He let the goblins follow, thinking they might serve as shields as they finally left the lair behind. Once they had covered a good distance, we see the goblin Boo finally reveal his true intentions, sensing the time and place were exactly right. He shot a glance at the goblins by his side, telling them to find their positions and wait for the perfect opening to strike from behind. They wanted to show this bratty elf what happens when someone dares to steal their woman, and a second later, the goblin lunged at him. What they didn't realize, of course, was that he had already seen through all their little tricks along the way, instantly taking them down. Boo turned pale with fright, realizing he had severely misjudged his opponent, though he still believed he had an ace up his sleeve. He mocked the idea of being killed, as his shadow, which had been hiding in our protagonist's own, suddenly emerged behind him. His massive, dark blade was already aimed straight for the neck. At this distance, even a high-level growing elf shouldn't have been able to dodge. But just as the sword fell, his body turned black as ink, dissolving into a shadow and passing through the blade as if it were nothing. Boo was stunned, and though he tried to summon a shadow to block the counterattack, he was already far too late. By the time he re-emerged, he had already crossed the shadow and was standing right in front of Boo, hand aimed directly at his throat. A few seconds later, the system voice announced his victory, granting him the shadow clone skill and a point of strength. As Boo's head fell, the other goblins finally reacted in disbelief, though they were cynical enough to try and blame him first. They called him detestable for harming one of their own and prepared to swarm him, an ambitious plan, to be honest. Faced with the horde, he remained perfectly calm, moving with a pace that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances. And then, quite suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The voice of an adventurer rang out, spotting the group while they were out on their patrol with the low-level goblins. Seeing the humans charging, he immediately distanced himself, earning a shout from a nearby goblin who called him a useless coward. The goblins threw themselves at the humans, and a fierce confrontation began as they tried to use their superior numbers to resist. An archer named Arna saw him escaping and gave chase. Seeing he was alone, our protagonist purposely slowed his pace. He was leading him deep into the dense forest, where the archer shouted for him to come out and die. A bold request, certainly. A sudden presence behind him startled Arna, his face twisting into pure surprise as he wondered if this goblin could actually speak the human tongue. He questioned if he was facing a rare species, though the aura wasn't quite right. Perhaps, he thought, this was simply a very special individual. After clearing his head, Arna feigned a calm expression and replied that killing monsters was simply the duty of all adventurers. Our protagonist didn't respond, merely staring at him until the archer grew so nervous that he couldn't help but take a step back. Suddenly, he spoke, noting that since he saw no killing intent in the archer's eyes, he wouldn't kill him, leaving Arna completely stunned as he walked away. Returning to the others, we see that the adventurers and low-level goblins are nearly all wounded on the ground, leaving only two still standing. A greatsword warrior named Del and a single goblin remained. The creature let out a furious roar as lightning crackled in its palm. But just as they were about to clash, an arrow sliced through the air, a perfect shot aimed directly at the goblin's heart. The onlookers were left speechless, and in our protagonist's ears, the familiar system notification announced that the goblin had been eliminated. He had acquired the lightning attack skill, but just as he was putting his bow away to leave, a furious shout echoed through the trees. A sharp knife whistled toward him, forcing him to leap from the tree and change his position in a single, fluid motion. He immediately felt an intense, murderous aura locking onto him, and with a hardened gaze, he launched himself into a counterattack. With a single blow, he sent Del flying into a large tree. The warrior stared back in disbelief, realizing this opponent was truly different. Despite the green skin and pointed ears, his face looked remarkably human, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the battered warrior. Seeing his overwhelming power, the rest of the team screamed for their captain to run, but Del struggled to his feet with grim determination. He declared he would never abandon his comrades, raising his sword once more to charge, a brave gesture, if a bit futile. Our protagonist simply raised a hand and caught the blade between his fingers with no effort at all, much to Del's absolute horror. Seeing the clear intent to kill in the warrior's eyes, he decided there was no reason for mercy and delivered a crushing kick to the man's stomach. As Del collapsed, coughing up blood, a cold, killing impulse crossed our protagonist's mind, though his mother's teachings suddenly echoed in his head. In that tense moment, Del's companion screamed with all his might, threatening that the Adventurers Guild would soon have their revenge. The man shouted that they would exterminate every last one. Hearing those words, the dagger in our protagonist's hand trembled slightly as he looked at Del. He asked if they truly intended to kill all the goblins, and the warrior confirmed it, adding they would rescue the innocent prisoners as well. He told them they had better work hard then, warning that if they failed their word, he would return to kill them before turning to leave. Watching him walk away, Del stood there with his mouth wide open, unable to believe that in a moment of life or death, he had been spared. Confused, he shouted at the protagonist's back, asking what he was playing at and if he felt pity for them, swearing that he would eventually succeed. He vowed to finish off all the goblins, though he warned his own kind to be careful, as there was one among them who was incredibly powerful. After that, our protagonist vanished completely from sight, leaving Del standing there utterly stunned, staring in the direction where the creature had disappeared. He thought to himself that there was something very strange about that goblin, wondering if it had been a provocation, a thought he simply couldn't accept. To be honest, he never imagined the day would come when a low-level monster would spare his life. It was a complete humiliation he swore to repay. Meanwhile, as our protagonist planned his return to the nest, he spotted a dying goblin knight and immediately realized something was terribly wrong. He had faced a goblin knight before and hadn't been a match for it, which made him wonder what kind of enemy could have defeated such a creature. He looked around carefully, but strangely enough, there wasn't a single trace of a battle to be found. This suggested that the Goblin Knight had somehow managed to escape from wherever the actual fight had taken place. But just as he was preparing to move on and leave the area, the Goblin Knight lying on the ground suddenly stirred with a final burst of strength. It grabbed him by the ankle, whispering hoarsely that everyone else was dead. The dying creature begged him to take a specific item and deliver it directly to the Goblin General. With a hint of curiosity, he took the crystal that the goblin had been clutching tightly in its hand. At that exact moment, an arrow sliced through the air with deadly precision. Fortunately, he was agile enough to leap away just in time to dodge the projectile. In the distance, an elf with pointed ears watches everything unfold with a sharp, calculating gaze. He frowns in frustration, realizing that the goblin somehow managed to escape his shot. To be honest, there was something about that creature's aura that felt strangely familiar to him. Meanwhile, our protagonist runs at full speed until he finally reaches the safety of the goblin nest. Just as he is about to step inside, he is struck by a sudden, nagging premonition. He turns around slowly, peering back into the depths of the dark, silent forest. He couldn't help but frown, wondering if the feeling had simply been his imagination playing tricks on him. Deciding not to overthink it, he turns back and ventures deep into the heart of the great dark forest. He pushes the unease aside, telling himself it was nothing, and finally reaches the entrance to the second basement level. However, a massive, imposing figure suddenly steps forward to block his path. As he is told to get out of the way, the Goblin General simply raises an eyebrow in silent challenge. It seemed the general knew he was carrying something that hadn't been handed over yet. Our protagonist frowned slightly, as if suddenly remembering the dying knight's final request. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out the crystal, and hands it over to the Goblin General. The general takes the recording crystal and immediately begins to inject it with his own magical power. At that moment, the very air around them begins to ripple and shimmer slightly. Immediately after, a blue light flickers into existence, forming something that looks very much like a screen. The screen reveals a distant valley, focusing on a small, secluded house marked by a red star. Inside, we see a grim altar constructed from carefully piled sea bones. And just outside the altar, a complex magic circle has been drawn using shimmering liquid laffy. Upon seeing that scene, the Goblin General wears a strange expression of pure disgust. He hadn't expected the Gate of Truth, those disgusting things, to find their way here as well. The Gate of Truth, exactly. They are merely individuals who, under the pretext of seeking the ultimate truth, willingly sacrifice their very souls to a malevolent god. They are loathsome creatures who draw their dark power directly from the earth. The traps set by these cultists lead to absolute massacre. And they don't limit themselves to humans. Anything of flesh and bone becomes their target. For that reason, all the great races detest them with a passion. Our protagonist simply nodded, making it quite clear that he wasn't interested in the slightest. Just as he turned his back to leave, the Goblin General, the leader, spoke up. Did he say he could leave? Hadn't he made himself clear before? From now on, he would have to come and see the general every single day. And why on earth should he listen to such a demand? Because the general intended to teach him advanced combat techniques. He insisted it was for his own good, though our protagonist maintained he needed no teacher. Seeing just how stubborn the young goblin was, the general felt a massive headache coming on. Suddenly, the Goblin General recalled the cryptic words of the Goblin Shaman, Sa. He abruptly changed his mind, proposing that if the boy managed to wound him, this would be his. With that, the Goblin General extended his hand. They were seeds that he had originally intended to bring to Elena. Almost instantly, our protagonist vanished from the spot where he stood. The Goblin General smiled with clear approval at such a display. Deep down, he was truly marveling at the young goblin's incredible speed. A fluorescent flash flickered, and, suddenly, the seeds in his hand had vanished without a trace. In their place, there was now a faint, light scratch across his palm. Although the wound wasn't deep, it emanated a strange and unsettling aura. It was as if some kind of power were silently surging from within the cut. The Goblin General lowered his gaze to study the wound on his hand. A slow, satisfied smile began to spread across his face. The boy had grown, and with such undeniable talent as well. He truly was worthy of being the king, the general murmured to himself. And we see a sudden glint of determination flashing within his eyes. Right at that very moment, the Goblin General suddenly coughed up a mouthful of blood. It was as dark as an 82 law fight, and his face instantly turned a ghostly shade. He looked incredibly pale, and his body began to sway, as if on the verge of collapsing. The Goblin General wiped the blood from the corner of his lips with a steady hand. A renewed spark of resolve shone brightly in his weary eyes. He knew he couldn't afford to fall just like that, not yet, anyway. He still had far more important things to attend to before his time was up. It seems that, somehow, he had managed to snatch away the seeds the general had been holding so tightly. But shortly after leaving that spot, our protagonist coughed up a mouthful of blood. He leaned weakly against the cold stone wall, his strength clearly failing him. Opening his palm, he gazed down at the 3 glowing seeds he had fought so hard for. A faint, weary smile escaped his lips as he looked at them. He thought of his mother, certain that this would make her very happy indeed. After a brief rest, he prepared himself to return to the safety of the lair. But just as he tried to stand, his body tilted forward, completely out of his control. Instead of hitting the ground, he fell into a warm embrace and looked up to see Elena once again. She sighed, wondering what on earth had happened to him this time. Elena held him carefully in her arms, her concern for him quite evident. He tried to pull himself up, but his power was spent, and she held him firmly in place. To be honest, her rather ample attributes were making it quite difficult for him to breathe. Fortunately, Elena realized the predicament just in time. She helped him lean back against the wall so he could finally catch his breath and rest. Then, with a worried look, she asked him if he was truly all right. He forced a small smile, assuring her that he was fine. He claimed he was only a bit dizzy, and seeing that he was stable, Elena let out a sigh of relief and, with great skill, produced bandages and a potion. And so, she began the delicate task of tending to his wounded hands. Elena paused for a brief moment, stopping exactly what she was doing. She immediately looked up and asked him why he was saying such things. He admitted that he used to be strong, but now, that wasn't quite the case anymore. She questioned him, wondering if she was wrong to believe he was stronger than that man. He asked her, with a hint of surprise, if she actually wanted him to kill the man for her. But no, he declared that he would be the one to kill him with his own 2 hands. Upon hearing him speak of killing Xiaotian, a flicker of sadness inevitably crossed Elena's eyes. She hesitated for a second before quietly asking if he truly hated him. Hate. He seemed puzzled, as if the very concept of hate was foreign to him. He didn't know the answer, so she asked why he was so determined to kill him then. He simply shook his head again, looking completely and utterly confused by the question. She told him that if he intended to kill him, he would have to work incredibly hard. After all, the man was very strong, certainly much stronger than she was. As she spoke, Elena stared at the moonlight reflecting on the wall, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. Suddenly, a few books slipped out from her sleeve and tumbled to the ground. He looked down and saw a title that asked, How to Forge a Mother. He managed to read halfway through another title about being a proper mother before stopping. Elena snatched them away instantly, clearly embarrassed by the sudden revelation. Her face was completely flushed as she pointedly avoided meeting his gaze. He asked if she had children of her own, but she quickly replied that no, she didn't. He couldn't help but wonder, if she didn't have children, why on earth was she reading books like those? She simply replied that she wanted to become a worthy mother. As she spoke, Elena finally turned to look at him, staring directly into his eyes. And then, with an incredibly serious expression, she asked him a question he never expected. She asked if he could be her son, begging for the chance to finally become a worthy mother. Well, that was a bit awkward. King Fint already had a mother of his own, after all. He suggested that if she truly wanted a child, she could simply have one of her own. Upon being rejected, Elena lowered her head, looking completely disillusioned. Deep down, it seemed she was carrying a very painful secret. Meanwhile, seeing that his body had finally recovered, he stood up and tested his strength with a few jumps. He felt great, and so, he decided it was time to say his goodbyes to Elena. He told her he was heading out, keeping things brief as he prepared to leave. Elena watched him with a certain tenderness, nodding slowly as she saw him walk away. A strange, unreadable emotion flickered through her gaze in that moment. Instinctively, she placed her hand over her womb, a gesture filled with quiet longing. Her expression grew darker and more somber by the second. She whispered to herself that she would never forgive those people, the ones who had cruelly stripped away her right to ever be a mother. We then follow him back to his hideout, where things were about to take a sudden turn. The moment he opened the door, a dark silhouette lunged at him without warning. He reacted immediately, and just as he was about to raise his dagger to strike, a familiar scent reached him, causing him to lower his guard instantly. "King Feng, you've finally returned," she said with relief. "Come here, let your mother get a good look at you." Seeing his injuries, she asked what happened, and he told her about his clash with the Goblin General. Upon hearing this, Victoria became even more convinced of her theory. She was certain the Goblin General was personally training his son to become his eventual successor, which, in her mind, was a very good thing. After all, in a world like this, power is everything, and she wanted him to have it. Suddenly, he remembered the small gift he had prepared for his mother. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few seeds, and handed them over to her. They were moon lotus seeds, and they left his mother looking completely astonished. She wondered how on earth he had managed to find such rare seeds. But to be honest, he had no idea what kind of flower they actually were. He simply tilted his head and looked at her with a face full of confusion. She explained that the moon lotus is an incredibly beautiful flower. Legend says that its buds bring a small touch of luck to whoever finds them. It is a poisonous flower, yet one supposedly blessed by the goddess of fortune. She asked if he wanted to see them bloom, and of course, he said yes. She warned they would take a long time to grow, but he suspected it wouldn't be that long. All it would take, he realized, was a little bit of effort from the micro-elves. Victoria carefully buried the seeds in the soil. Immediately afterward, she closed her eyes in concentration. She placed her hands over her chest, looking for all the world as if she were offering a prayer. "Oh, micro-elves," she whispered, "hear my humble request. Allow the life that sleeps buried deep within the ground to germinate and grow." And as soon as her chant ended, the room, which had been cast in shadows, was suddenly filled with light. Specks of starlight began to gather from every direction, swirling in a gentle dance around Victoria's body. Not long after, the seed she had just finished burying began to sprout, pushing up tender green leaves from the earth. And then, one by one, tiny flower buds appeared among the leaves. Finally, thanks to the efforts of the micro-elves, one after another, the beautiful moon lotus flowers bloomed. In the dim light of the lair, they displayed their full, radiant splendor. Seeing such a magical scene, King Feng couldn't help but cry out with excitement. "What do you think?" she asked. "It's quite beautiful, isn't it?" "It's very beautiful," he replied. "Mom, you're incredible." Then she looked at him and asked, "So, King Feng, would you like to learn?" "I do want to," he replied, though he wondered if he would truly be capable of learning. "Since you carry my blood, King Feng, rest assured that you can," Victoria told him. She explained that what she was about to teach him wasn't exactly magic. Rather, it was a special kind of art that only certain elves are ever able to master. Victoria then watched as the flashes of light began to surround her son. She quickly covered her mouth, unable to hide her genuine surprise. She hadn't imagined that the little spirits of light would take such a liking to him. Even though he was a goblin, he excitedly exclaimed that he was just like his mother. Victoria gently stroked his head, a deeply satisfied expression crossing her face. She told him he had great talent, and he let himself be carried away by her tender touch. Deep in his heart, a sense of calm and happiness emerged that was simply impossible to describe. But as we often see in these stories, that moment of peace was not destined to last. A strange presence began to invade the lair, moving with stealthy, quiet steps. King Feng was the first to notice the subtle change in the air around them. Quickly, he drew the small dagger from his waist with practiced ease. He hurled it toward a dark corner, which, to be honest, was a very impressive reaction. Immediately, a shadow went darting out from the darkness to avoid the blade. "Ouch, is this really how you welcome a lady?" a voice called out. As they listened to her voice, a seductive figure slowly emerged from the gloom. A long black dress tightly hugged her slender waist as she stepped into the light. Her long black hair fell loosely around her shoulders. A light veil covered her face, adding an air of mystery to her arrival. It left only her enchanting eyes visible to those watching. They were eyes that seemed to see everything, and she immediately identified Victoria as being from the demon clan. She admitted she hadn't expected to find a pure-blooded elf in a place like this. It seems that if one lives long enough, they truly do end up seeing everything. The stranger found it quite ironic to think that a pure-blooded elf would ever be captured. She mocked those elves who stay in their places of death, clinging to a nobility that she clearly didn't believe in. She wondered aloud what would happen if those haughty aristocrats ever found out about this. She mused about what those old, stubborn fools would think of the situation. King Feng demanded to know what the devil she was doing there, but he didn't wait for an answer. He moved with surprising speed, sliding quickly behind her to strike. Just as he was about to attack, the opponent raised a massive scythe and blocked his blow with ease. Immediately afterward, he felt a terrifying force surging from the weapon. The impact sent him flying backward, making it clear he was no match for this woman. In any other situation, he likely would have fled without a second thought. But now, he had to protect his mother, who was standing right behind him. The woman seemed amused, noting that he had actually chosen to step forward. She admitted it wasn't a bad effort, considering he dared to advance even though he couldn't win. She decided then and there to test just how strong he really was. With those words, Marika brandished her scythe and brought it crashing down toward him. The sheer power behind that single strike was enough to be fatal. Suddenly, Victoria cried out, begging her not to dare lay a finger on her son. In the very next second, faint points of light began to shimmer around Victoria's body. Countless green vines erupted from the earth as if they possessed a life of their own. They spread with incredible speed, firmly entangling Marika's hands and feet. Seeing this, Marika swung the massive scythe she held in her hand. She sliced through the vines with ease, or so it seemed at first. But the vines didn't die. Instead, they rapidly repaired their severed parts. And, quite surprisingly, they grew even thicker than they were before. When Marika saw this, her face finally betrayed a sense of genuine misfortune. As they grew thicker, a hint of panic touched her. She realized she was facing a spirit mage. But what did that matter? With a deafening roar that shook the air, an immense wave of magical power erupted from deep within Marika's body. With a single swing of her scythe, the thick vines were utterly shattered. But by then, he had already managed to escape, taking his mother with him. She pleaded with him to let her go, terrified that staying together would lead to their discovery. He refused, insisting that if they were to leave, they would leave together. Suddenly, we see Nemo burst onto the scene directly in front of them. He immediately placed his mother behind him, determined to protect her at any cost. And here, our protagonist's gaze fills with deep suspicion, while Marika simply mocks him, calling him a mere goblin. She tells him he is quite strange, noting that goblins aren't supposed to understand the concept of a mother. She asks him directly why he is so intent on protecting the woman he calls his mother. Marika then gives him a suggestive, mocking smile. And she does it on purpose, making sure she is right in front of Victoria when she does. She winks at him shamelessly, but he refuses to be intimidated by her games. Instead, he carefully sets his mother down and prepares himself for the coming fight. Without making a single sound, he suddenly appears directly behind Marika. He delivers what should have been a fatal blow aimed straight for her neck. But a scythe appearing out of thin air blocks his attack at the very last second. The resulting shockwave is so powerful that it sends him flying through the air, just as he is about to crash violently against the hard stone wall. A melodious, haunting song suddenly echoes through the area. And then, something truly magical happens right before our eyes. A giant dandelion suddenly erupts from the ground beneath him. It manages to catch him gently, softening his fall and setting him down safely. Marika scoffs, telling him his efforts are useless and asking if this pathetic display is all the power he has. She laughs with an air of absolute superiority, convinced she has already won. However, just as she is gloating over her victory, a mouthful of fresh blood suddenly bursts from her lips. She looks down to see a dark shadow holding the very dagger he had dropped earlier. The shadow is standing right behind her. At some point, he used the dagger to pierce right through her body. There is no trace of magic here. It is a pure, raw skill. How interesting, she thinks, but now, you've finally made me angry. Marika murmurs to herself, and suddenly, an incredibly powerful magical energy begins to surge. It erupts with fury from within her, and with it, Marika's body begins to undergo a strange transformation. We see her wounds healing at a visible, almost unnatural speed. She raises her hand slowly as an even more terrifying magical power gathers. It begins to concentrate in her palm, and we realize that in the face of absolute power, all tricks and techniques become utterly useless. So die, she commands, as Marika hurls a massive fireball toward him. There is no time to escape, and his mother hugs him tightly, protecting him with her own body. She summons countless vines from the ground in a desperate attempt to survive. The vines wrap around them for protection, but these plants, well, they were never going to be enough. Against that fireball, they were like moths drawn to a flame. They began to burn instantly, and the fireball continued its relentless path toward him. Dying like this would be a tragic end, but wait, something isn't quite right. When the dust finally settled, Marika realized that something had gone wrong with her plan. Rows and rows of goblin knights appeared in perfect formation. They had stepped in front of him, shielding him with their very bodies. They successfully blocked that terrifying magical attack. And the one leading them? Well, it was precisely the same goblin she had nearly killed earlier. Knight Tome spoke up, addressing the goblin who so clearly wanted them dead. He asked if she had even bothered to seek permission, while she wondered if they truly believed they could stop her. The response was cold. They weren't just going to stop her, they were going to kill her. She remarked it would be a pity to kill him, and then, the goblin stepped back. He looked at Marika with pure malice, questioning if they really thought they could achieve such a feat alone. With those words, she slowly raised her hand. A powerful surge of magical energy erupted from her body. She called upon the goddess of war and scorching fire. She begged the deity to listen to the prayer of her faithful servant. She commanded the flames and the fire to descend from above. Her goal was simple, to reduce all her enemies to nothing but ash. The moment she finished speaking, dozens of fireballs materialized behind Marika. They streaked toward the goblin knights like a shower of deadly meteors. But as they faced the burning spheres, the goblin knights simply laughed and, instead of retreating, they pressed forward. They charged straight ahead, completely ignoring the intense heat of the flames. The fireballs raining down on them didn't seem to have even the slightest effect. It was useless, as they explained that this type of magic simply doesn't work against goblin knights. Then, quite suddenly, a thin line of blood appeared across her neck. Morlika smiled as she brandished the black scythe in her hand. As she began harvesting the knights, the goblins tried to organize and gather their strength. She mocked them, noting just how fragile they truly were. Upon seeing two of his brothers fall in an instant, the goblin knight's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. Anger burned deep within him, and he immediately gave the order to kill her. A seductive, chilling laugh echoed through the goblin lair. Wave after wave of goblin knights threw themselves bravely into the attack. But their enemy harvested their lives with a terrifying, almost casual ease. Morlika began to close in on you, scythe in hand. To protect you, the goblin knights roared and lunged toward the front lines. They blocked the enemy's advance, showing absolutely no fear of death in that moment. Even Victoria, who had always detested goblins with a passion, stood there completely stunned. She had never imagined such a thing. She couldn't believe these goblins would fight to the death just to protect her son. But you remained indifferent, pulling at your mother and pleading for her to leave quickly. She asked if you realized that Sin Fong and the others were all protecting you. She wondered if you were really going to let them pay for your safety with their lives. You simply asked why they were protecting you in the first place. After all, you hadn't done anything for them, nor had you asked for their protection. In your past life, you were a cold-blooded assassin. The very concept of protecting someone was something you didn't understand at all. But Victoria knew better. She couldn't allow you to remain so indifferent. She told you that no one can live alone in this world. You need companions, friends, and even someone to love. Seeing that your mother wouldn't move despite the danger, you simply took her in your arms. And we see that these goblin knights truly have no fear of death. It was at that moment that Morlika finally realized the truth. She saw that these goblins were willing to die, one after another, all for a simple low-level goblin, which naturally made her even more curious about your identity. She couldn't help but quicken her pace, facing the relentless wave of goblins head-on. She swung her scythe in a wide circle, unleashing a literal waltz of death. A circular slash of dark energy expanded outward from the very ground. It surged from Morlika's center, tearing through the earth in every direction. Everything that came into contact with that shadowy light was instantly cut down, disintegrated, and utterly annihilated. Sensing the danger, you immediately threw yourself to the ground with your mother, narrowly dodging the attack. But as you looked back, you saw the countless goblin knights who had stood behind you. They had all fallen, and Morlika advanced slowly, stepping over the goblin corpses. She asked if you were ready, calling you her little goblin, which was quite a chilling end to the chase. And so, you activated your skill, Shadow Step, and in an instant, we see you appear right in front of Morlika. Although she reacts quickly, your dagger still manages to wound her face. She curses you, asking if you realize a woman's face is as important as her life. Morlika is absolutely furious now, and she lunges at you with her scythe. Just as you prepare to dodge, you realize that you cannot move a muscle. You look down and see that the blood on the ground seems to have a life of its own. It has tangled itself around your feet, completely immobilizing you. It seems useless. Deep down, you know you cannot escape this. And just when you thought you were going to die, a shadow suddenly appears right in front of you. Blocking the deadly blow is Mu, the Goblin Knight. But at what cost? A mouthful of fresh blood bursts from the mouth of Mu, the Goblin Knight. Mu, the Goblin Knight, coughs weakly as his strength fades. And yet, he manages to utter one final word. The moment he finishes speaking, Victoria picks you up, seeing you completely paralyzed. She flees the scene quickly, and as she watches you from a distance, the Goblin Knight feels one last flicker of life within him. With a great roar, his muscles expand for one final stand. He challenges her to come forward, swearing he will never let her pass. Morlika finds this interesting, but she notes that she simply doesn't have time to play with him. She asks if he truly thinks he can stop her, and with that, the dark scythe and the long sword collide. The resulting shockwave is so powerful that it levels everything in the immediate vicinity. Watching from a distance, King Feng asks his mother why that man would block the attack for them. Victoria explains it was because he was protecting him, though the boy still wonders why. He repeats the question to himself, confused, remembering that the knight had wanted to capture his mother before. He recalls that the knight even wanted to kill him, and that he, in turn, had almost killed the knight. Victoria tells him that in the end, it doesn't matter if they are humans or goblins. Between temptation and the elves, she explains that everything in this world is subject to change. She suggests that this is something he will eventually have to figure out for himself. The questions haunt him. Why protect him? Could there be some hidden motive behind it all? And more importantly, he wonders how all of this is affecting his mother. She tells King Feng that she hopes one day he can act according to his own heart. She wants him to be able to save the people he truly wishes to save. Whether they are goblins or elves, she insists that the race doesn't actually matter. He is clearly confused, as his mind has been filled only with killing, not with the idea of saving. As for saving his mother, he wonders if that was just a matter of pure instinct. He can only nod in response, not fully grasping the weight of her words just yet. But then, Victoria pulls him into an embrace and whispers his name, King Feng. She tells him to remember that, no matter what he chooses to do, she will be there. She tells him to always put his own life first, making it his absolute maximum priority. If anything ever puts his life in danger, she insists he should simply ignore it and walk away. He had barely finished answering her when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. Without warning, a powerful shockwave struck them both with terrifying force. The impact was truly monstrous, sending Victoria flying as she desperately tried to escape. His mother covered him with her own body, shielding him so he wouldn't crash against the stone. But the force of the impact slammed her against the wall, leaving her completely unconscious. Seeing his mother lying there on the ground, he reaches out a trembling hand to shake her arm. He whispers to her, pleading for her to be okay, but there is no response. When Victoria doesn't react, the darkest of thoughts begins to cross his mind. Deep down, an indescribable fury begins to boil over from within him. Meanwhile, Morlika has absolutely no idea of the massive trouble she has just invited upon herself. She mocks them, asking if they really believe they could ever escape her grasp. She wonders aloud about Victoria, questioning if she truly believes she is the mother of a goblin. To her, the idea of sacrificing oneself to protect a simple goblin is utterly absurd. It was the last thing she expected to see, and Morlika covers her mouth, laughing hysterically. The moment she finished speaking, he lunged at her with everything he had. As the dagger and the scythe collide, the system immediately issues a sharp alert. And here we see that a limit break has been successfully activated. For a very short period of time, his attributes are about to improve drastically. Meanwhile, his face is twisted with rage as he grinds his teeth in silence. He stares directly at the person who dared to hurt his mother. Deep down, only one voice resonates in his heart. He is going to kill her. He will never forgive this, while Morlika finds herself surprised once again by his power. She wonders how a mere growing goblin could possibly possess such immense strength and speed. It is almost a miracle, really, but she quickly lets out a chuckle and exerts a bit of force. An overwhelming power begins to surge through the length of her scythe. In a single instant, the impact sends him flying backward through the air. To her, that level of power is simply far too weak to be a threat. Almost at the same time, however, he manages to adjust his posture mid-flight. In the blink of an eye, he vanishes completely from Morlika's sight. The next time he appears, he is in her blind spot, right behind her, aiming straight for her head. Morlika realizes the danger just in time and raises her scythe to block the strike. But then she notices that he has already disappeared once again. Morlika spins around, blocking the very moment he reappears to strike. After several intense exchanges, Morlika begins to frown slightly with annoyance. She hadn't imagined, even for a second, that his stealth skills would be this impressive. Soon enough, she loses her patience and screams in a fury, calling him a cursed brat. She decides she has had quite enough of his games, and her anger reaches a boiling point. And then, the magical power within her body suddenly erupts with terrifying intensity. With her magic expanding outward, she desperately tries to perceive exactly where he is hiding. But it is utterly useless, and we see Morlika begin to turn pale with genuine fright. The little one standing before her is somehow able to maintain his calm, even while consumed by fury. He is using techniques far too advanced for someone of his kind to be facing her like this. It is truly terrifying, and as she realizes this, a single drop of cold sweat rolls down Morlika's forehead. She raises her hand and forms a sphere of pure light. It illuminates the entire layer as she tries to use the brightness to find any trace of his movement. Meanwhile, we return to the Goblin Knight Mu. He was hurrying the arriving goblins along, but the moment they set foot inside the lair, they were met with a blinding light up ahead, causing everyone to stop dead in their tracks. They stand there, watching the scene with looks of absolute astonishment on their faces. He was moving through the dark and somber corners of the room like a shadow. He moved at a speed that they simply could not comprehend, which, to be honest, was quite a feat. He was relentlessly attacking every single one of Morlika's blind spots. It was something truly incredible to behold, and as they watched this scene unfold, the goblin knights who were present could only stare in silence. They no longer dared to underestimate the small, low-level goblin standing before them. In fact, they even began to feel a growing sense of admiration for him. It was a mix of respect and veneration, for in that moment, he had already cornered her. Morlika's entire body was now covered in a countless number of tiny, stinging cuts. But the wounds themselves weren't the real issue. The problem was the mysterious poison gradually seeping into her body. To her horror, not even detoxification magic seemed to have any effect. She knew that if this continued, the sheer agony would eventually be the end of her. In that desperate moment, Morlika began to lose her mind. She told herself that if she couldn't find him, she would simply destroy everything in sight. It was obvious she intended to take everyone down with her, a classic, if somewhat dramatic, last resort. She unleashed one fireball after another in quick succession. Each was larger than the last, as she prepared to bring the entire lair down around them. At that exact moment, our protagonist noticed that something was fundamentally wrong. He focused intently, trying to find Morlika's weak point. His goal was to interrupt her magic at the most crucial second possible. Suddenly, an imposing voice rang out, asking since when insects had been allowed in his territory. The Hobgoblin general narrowed his eyes at the scene. He raised an eyebrow and shouted toward the Goblin Knights standing in the distance. He revealed that she is merely a clone, and yet they had been struggling against her all this time. Worse still, they had allowed her to slaughter so many of their own kind. Upon hearing the general's words, the Goblin Knights were left utterly stunned. The being that had massacred hundreds of their compatriots was not even the real threat. That woman, had she really turned out to be nothing more than a clone? It makes one wonder, with a bit of a chill, just how powerful her original body must be. The Goblin Knights lowered their heads, overcome with a deep sense of shame. Deep down, they felt something wasn't right, as a mere double shouldn't be able to last this long. Furthermore, they told themselves it was impossible for a magical double to actually bleed. They were simply using their pathetic knowledge to deny what they couldn't possibly understand. However, she certainly hadn't expected a hobgoblin to be standing right there. Well, it certainly seems like you know quite a lot, don't you? It appears you have spent some time in the world of humans. For a double, you talk far too much, clearly trying to buy time before you die. Besides, if a parallel double dies, the original body will also suffer severe damage. Damn it, to be honest, he really did know far more than she liked. But even if she was only a double, she felt she was more than enough to finish them all off. The moment she finished speaking, Morlika gripped her black lotus tightly. And with that, she launched herself directly at the Goblin General. Upon seeing this, the massive Goblin warrior didn't seem particularly impressed. In fact, he showed a clear hint of disdain in his cold gaze. He didn't move a single muscle, simply raising his enormous palm to meet her. And as if he were a solid mountain, he firmly blocked Morlika's desperate attack. She wondered how this was possible. Where could such colossal power have come from? Was this really the same kind of goblin she thought she knew? She cursed under her breath, wondering how he dared to underestimate her so completely. Infuriated, Marika let out a roar as she caused her entire magical power to explode outward. Immediately, bursts of a thick black aura began to emanate from her scythe. We see these shadows transform into several long, dark serpents. They quickly coiled themselves around the Goblin General's massive hand. Upon seeing this, the Goblin warrior simply snorted with cold indifference. Just a moment later, a deafening crash echoed through the air. The force was so great that it sent Marika's body flying backward. Marika spat out blood, and it was quite evident that she was gravely injured. She fell to the ground, fully aware that her life was now in serious danger. She realized too late that she couldn't escape this enemy, so she concentrated all her remaining magic deep inside. She was compressing it, ready to release it all. She really is a complete lunatic, isn't she? But just as the Goblin General was about to make his move, out of nowhere, you appeared directly in front of Marika. Just as she was preparing to say something to you, she was silenced forever by the cold edge of your dagger. Congratulations are in order, as you have successfully slain a demonic parallel entity. In doing so, you have obtained one of her unique talents, blood control. However, blinded by rage, you didn't stop there. You continued to torture Marika until even the Goblin General standing nearby couldn't bear to watch anymore. He reached out and firmly grabbed your hand, telling you that enough was enough. That elf isn't dead yet, but if you continue like this, he warned, there is no guarantee she will survive. Li Wenyan calmed down immediately and rushed toward his mother, desperately shaking her by the arm. Mom, wake up, he pleaded, telling her that Shinfen had already killed the bad guy. Suddenly, we see him remember the magic his mother had used to heal him once before. And so, he began to carefully imitate exactly what she had done in that moment. He started summoning the same micro-elves that had appeared back then. Tiny points of starlight flickered into existence, beginning to swirl all around him. The goblins standing nearby were left completely stunned by the sight. An elf capable of wielding true elven sorcery is already a rare thing among their own kind. To be honest, it is a talent that very few ever truly master. And it is practically unheard of for a goblin like him to achieve such a feat. Even the Goblin General found himself momentarily frozen in complete perplexity. He watched, baffled, as he realized the boy was actually about to cast elven sorcery. Recovering his senses, the Goblin General gave a sharp signal with his eyes. He immediately issued a silent command to the high-ranking Goblin Knights. And then, as the General and the rest of the goblins looked on in disbelief, the magic took hold. With the successful activation of the sorcery, the atmosphere shifted entirely. A soft, radiant white light suddenly illuminated everything in the surrounding area. And beneath this white light, beautiful, colorful flowers began to bloom one after another. Even the massive Goblin General stood there, silently bathed in the gentle glow. He felt as though his old internal wounds, which had plagued him for so long, were surprisingly starting to show genuine signs of improvement. He wondered just how many more surprises this little king was going to give him. Suddenly, from within the white light, a creature no larger than a palm appeared. It had pointed ears, long flowing hair, and a pair of tiny wings on its back. The creature chuckled, calling those gathered their insignificant beings. It commanded them to come and worship the great elemental spirit. This was one of the 7 original pillars of the world, the pillar representing light itself, His Highness, Arius Andex. However, his arrogant declaration was met with absolutely no response at all. Seeing that his mother still wouldn't wake up, the boy let his long green ears droop in disappointment. The spirit was indignant, shouting for attention as he felt completely dismissed. He demanded to know how the boy dared to summon him only to ignore him. Since the boy had called him, the spirit found it absurd that he was now being questioned. He admitted that if the boy didn't have such a pleasant scent, he wouldn't even bother listening, but the boy simply asked if he could save his mother. Agreeing to help, the compassionate spirit gently landed on Victoria's forehead. Instantly, we see a faint, soothing light begin to emanate from her body. It only took a second for Arius to understand the overall situation. He reassured the boy that nothing was wrong. She just needed some sleep to recover. In the future, don't you dare call me for such a trivial matter as this, the spirit grumbled. I'm a very busy individual as well. Every single day, I have to groom my wings. I must fix my hair. And of course, I have to bathe. And then there are the prayers of the other spirits I must listen to. Upon hearing the spirit confirm that his mother was going to be fine, the boy breathed a deep sigh of relief, completely ignoring the talkative little spirit. He simply lifted his mother into his arms and began to walk away. By the time Arius realized what was happening, the boy had already moved quite a distance away. Curse him, who does this guy think I am? He summons me, and then doesn't even pay me any mind. What a disgrace. Respectfully, Your Highness, great elemental spirit. Hearing that voice, Arius turned around immediately, when he saw that it was Half-Goblin standing there. His eyes, which just a moment ago held a mischievous glint, turned ice cold. For a mere goblin, he seemed far too knowledgeable. You know quite a lot of things, don't you? The spirit remarked sharply. Especially for someone who is supposed to be just a low-level goblin. We return to the boy, who is currently surrounded by a group of low-level goblin knights. Being led toward the armory with a somber expression, he maintains his place in the formation. He follows the battalion of goblins deep into the interior of the armory. And then, they all came to a halt in front of a massive iron wall. Very well, wait here for a moment, the lead goblin commanded. The walls, which until that moment appeared to be nothing more than solid rock, suddenly split down the middle, revealing a narrow space hidden behind them. This was a freight elevator, a device designed to make vertical movement much easier. Naturally, the others were quite excited to see such a novel piece of technology. But the boy was the only one who remained completely indifferent to the sight. After all, in the world he came from, these things were incredibly common. After descending 30 meters in the lift, what appeared before their eyes was a vast room, constructed entirely of metal. He gave the place a quick, analytical glance. If it weren't for the fact that the old man insisted on seeing this, he never would have left his injured mother alone, not even for a second. At that moment, Arius was perched comfortably on his shoulder, watching everything with a sense of wonder that was impossible to miss. In fact, his curiosity was so immense that it simply couldn't be hidden. What are all these things? I never imagined these ugly goblins were capable of building something like this. Hey, kid, why aren't you saying anything? He cast a brief, sideways glance at Arius. His eyes then scanned the other goblins present in the room. He realized that, aside from himself, no other goblin could actually see this little spirit. Arius seemed to realize exactly what he was thinking in that moment. And so, he whispered softly into his ear, "Don't you worry, little one. These low-level goblins are completely incapable of seeing the great Arius." Soon, under Goblinling's guidance, they arrived in front of a massive iron door. As the door creaked open, he heard a sound that was strangely familiar. A rapid burst of gunfire, one shot after another, echoed through the air. It resonated throughout the spacious room. Is that a watchstone over there? These are commonly known as firearms, deadly tools of war. They are a high-tech product originally from the Eastern continent. After a great deal of effort, we finally managed to develop them on our own. Goblin Jung, with a face full of pride, was presenting her greatest achievements. The other goblins were clearly anxious to get started and try them out. But our protagonist remained there with that same unfriendly, stoic expression, without showing even the slightest hint of emotion, which was impressive, in a way. And this, as we can see, has Goblin Jung feeling quite annoyed. But she has no idea that Arius, sitting on his shoulder, is wide awake, does she? What are all these things? They look absolutely fascinating, the spirit chirped. The great master Arius only had time for a tiny little nap, it seems. And I never thought that upon waking, there would be so many new things in this world. He, however, completely ignored Arius's constant, excited chatter. We see him approach the weapons rack, where he picks up the only sniper rifle on the shelf. He holds it in his hands for a moment, examining the craftsmanship with a critical eye. And to be honest, he is quite disappointed, as sniper rifles are very different from other weapons. They require an incredibly high level of precision during the manufacturing process. If even the smallest detail is off, the accuracy is completely ruined. And a rifle without precision is, quite frankly, a total suicide mission. At that moment, a group of goblins approaches with a rather aggressive attitude. Hey, watch it. That thing is our crown jewel, they barked. Don't you dare break it. If it gets damaged, you're taking full responsibility, understand? They were clearly terrified that a few villagers might ruin the work that cost them so much effort. Goblin Shandon notices that behind the one speaking, there is another goblin who looks badly beaten. And in that instant, he understands perfectly why they are acting so defensively. Weren't we supposed to have explained this already? He asked calmly. The disappearance of Goblin Bu had absolutely nothing to do with them. The goblins, however, weren't buying it. You call that an explanation? Oh, really? You want explanations? Well, we're about to give you a very thorough one right now. Goblin Bao rolls up his sleeves, looking perfectly ready to settle the matter with his fists. Fortunately, Goblin Ling Ling steps in just in time to prevent a disaster. What on earth are you doing? Are you trying to kill each other, or what? She shouted. You're acting as if I'm not even here, right in front of Captain Jing. Goblin Wu doesn't dare to keep causing trouble after that. He quickly tries to explain himself, claiming it was all just a misunderstanding, Captain Jing. He says they only wanted to test themselves against these goblins from the Great Goblin Nest. They simply wanted to see how good they really were, and that was all. He mentions having heard that the goblins trained in the Great Nest are incredibly strong. That is why they wanted to test them, or so he claims, anyway. He asks if they are perhaps too afraid to try, which is quite a bold provocation among goblins. He points out that they know these weapons like the back of their hands. Meanwhile, his group has no idea how they work, so he asks again if they are simply scared. Chief Goblin Chandon, as we might expect, could not stand such a blatant provocation. He accepted immediately, and seeing this, Goblin Bao jumped forward, pointed at you, and challenged you to a duel. And to ensure no one says he is taking advantage, he offers to let you choose the type of competition. Shooting, performance, or assembly. He tells you to take your pick. You, meanwhile, were busy observing the weapon in your hands, completely focused. You didn't even bother to look up at Goblin Bao, which was a bit of a cold shoulder, really. Absolutely furious, Goblin Bao began throwing a tantrum right there on the side. He cursed under his breath, swearing he would humiliate you before finally killing you. Even Yaryuzo was starting to feel a bit worried for your sake. He asks if you actually know how to use these strange little toys. And so, it is decided. The competition will be to see who can disassemble and reassemble the weapon fastest. It isn't fair, he argues, since you already know these things by heart. We don't even know them, which is why I let him choose from the start, right? Of course, if you're afraid and want to back out, that's allowed too, he adds. Goblin Bao said this while looking at you with a deeply provocative smirk. Yaryuzo, perched on your shoulder, was starting to get quite annoyed by this. Who does this ugly guy think he is? Hey, little one, listen to me. If you beg the great Lord Yaryuzo for help, I might just tell you the trick to winning, you know? But, as it turns out, you didn't pay the slightest bit of attention to Yaryuzo's words. You simply turned to face Goblin Bao and calmly said, all right, as you wish. Chief Goblin Chandon tried to stop you right then and there. However, Goblin Xiao stepped in and convinced him not to interfere. Don't you think Master Infeng looks incredibly confident in himself? And to be honest, when has that man ever looked anything less than certain? First, let's see how it goes. If I lose, well, I lose and that's that. It's not like I'm going to die from it. Meanwhile, on the other side, we see that you and Goblin Bao have already arrived at the workbench. Goblin Bao is showing a great deal of confidence in his own abilities. He has no intention of losing to a complete novice, or so he thinks. However, there is something very important that he doesn't know yet. The truth is, he wasn't dealing with a novice at all. In his past life, he had practically grown up playing with these sorts of things. He knew these weapons as well as the palm of his own hand. Well, let's begin, Goblin Bao said, his face twisted into an expression of pure arrogance. He barely gripped his weapon, waiting eagerly to see a look of clumsy confusion on the man's face. But he never expected that the weapon in Feng's hands would already be halfway disassembled. Barely a second had passed, and in that instant, the other goblins were left completely speechless. The silence lasted until he slammed the weapon onto the table with a sharp clack. It was only then that everyone finally snapped back to reality. Goblin Bao, what are you doing just standing there? Upon hearing Goblin Wu's voice, Goblin Bao reacted immediately. He began to take his own weapon apart, but by then, it was already far too late. The goblin, feeling both furious and humiliated, finally gave up. He shouted at him, demanding to know how he could possibly be so skilled. Almost at that exact same moment, the sound of a single gunshot rang out. Goblin Bao didn't even have enough time to process what was happening. A small, dark hole had already appeared right in the center of his forehead. Then, with a dull thud, he collapsed to the ground, dead. Following the origin of the shot, the goblins' gazes all landed on Infeng. They saw his pistol held high, with a thin trail of smoke still drifting from the barrel. Congratulations, you have successfully killed a goblin. And thanks to the effect of your predator skill, something interesting happens. You have obtained that goblin's talent, self-healing. Why did you do that? Goblin Wu demanded. Hadn't you already won? He wondered if this was how the man had managed to annihilate the entire goblin tribe. A goblin like him, who massacres his own people, deserved nothing but death. Death, Infeng replied coldly. That is exactly why I killed him. He didn't see what was wrong with it, or who had told him otherwise. The others couldn't understand what gave him the right to kill his opponent just for winning. To him, it was common sense. In his past life, during assassin training, such contempt for losers led to only one thing. And that was death, though, to be fair, this wasn't exactly an assassin training camp. His words in that moment were a clear provocation to every goblin present. The goblins were on the verge of lunging at him all at once. But then, Goblin Shandon stepped in to stop them, asking what they thought they were doing to his people. "Your goblin killed my goblin," the other retorted, citing the general's rules. Feng simply asked if he had really done anything wrong by killing him. Shandon insisted that what he saw was the other goblin trying to kill King Feng first. In his eyes, the man had only fired the shot to protect himself. "You miserable wretch," the opponent spat, asking if he had even heard what was just said. He tried to tell them all to calm down, reminding them that, after all, they were all goblins. The goblin captain hadn't even finished launching his verbal assault. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently. While the goblins looked around, wondering what on earth was happening, red lights abruptly flared up everywhere, bathing the cavern in a crimson glow. And with them came a shrill, piercing warning alarm. Someone had invaded the lair. On the very day we see him visiting the goblin factory with his team to test their weapons. The goblin lair was suddenly under siege, right in front of the adventurers who had come to strike. A group of low-level goblins threw themselves recklessly against the intruders. They headed straight for their home, and naturally, they weren't given a chance to reach it. But witnessing this suicidal act was another matter entirely. The goblins could no longer understand it. Why send them off to die like that? With their combined combat power, they could have handled these enemies without any trouble at all. Of course, the plan was for the invaders to see what they perceived as a weak point. That way, they would lower their guard and venture even deeper into the trap. The leader told them to just watch and see how these arrogant adventurers would react. They would find their graves right here, but for the goblins, the cost was high. He wondered if the lives of his comrades meant anything at all. Does the life of your own people truly matter so little to you, Great Goblin? With a grim expression, he took up his sword and began walking toward the door. The others called out, asking him what he thought he was doing. What was he doing? Well, it was quite simple. He was going to kill every single one of the invaders waiting outside. With that said, the Great Goblin simply ignored Goblin Changdong's warnings. He turned his back and walked away, heading straight toward the first level of the goblins. Shere Goblin also wanted to move forward and follow him, but he was immediately stopped by Goblinya, who looked at him as if to say, "And what about you? You insignificant thing, do you actually want to go out there just to be killed?" With a single hand, and quite effortlessly, Goblinya reached out. He lifted Shere Goblin high into the air, while the poor thing kicked and struggled with all his might. Deep down, he knew he had to get out of there immediately. He needed to warn the adventurers outside about the true situation. He had to tell them to flee quickly, because if they didn't, every single one of those people would die here, without a shadow of a doubt. Thinking of this, Shere Goblin desperately began to scratch at Goblinya. "Well, he certainly has some spirit, but I can't let you keep scratching at Goblinya like that. If you don't want anything bad to happen to that girl in your room, it would be much better for you to stay perfectly still." We see Arius, who had been watching the entire scene unfold. He wore a malicious smile, while the rest of the goblins remained fixed on the large screen. But for Arius, none of that seemed to matter in the slightest. Instead, he remembered the promise he had made to Chris. And so, he left the training grounds directly, leaving the chaos behind him. Goblin Wu had seen him slip away, and he immediately gathered his men to follow. He left the training grounds directly, but though Goblin Wu gave chase, he didn't count on our protagonist vanishing without a trace the moment he turned the corner. By then, he had already reached the third lower level of the goblin's lair. This was, of course, after finally shaking off those persistent nuisances. He walked alone through a cold, metallic corridor. He observed everything around him, carefully preparing to draw a map of the area. Suddenly, he sensed a movement nearby. He immediately masked his presence and hid, waiting to see what would emerge. Not far away, we see Goblin Shui engaged in a conversation with a human woman. He watched as Goblin Shui pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to the woman, telling her to deliver it to Marino. The servant took the note, turned around, and left without looking back. As he watched the servant disappear into the distance, Goblin Shui maintained a deeply serious expression. Then, he let out a heavy sigh, just as he was turning to leave himself. But in that moment, he suddenly noticed the presence of another goblin. He wondered aloud how their little guest of honor had managed to find his way down here. He asked if his apprentice had perhaps failed to look after him as promised. Upon hearing his name, King Fintaran decided there was no longer any point in hiding. He stepped out slowly, and at the sight of him, Goblin Shui let out a dry laugh. "The general was right, it seems. You certainly have your tricks. You almost managed to deceive even this old man." When asked how he had been discovered, Goblin Shui simply laughed out loud. He didn't deny it, of course, but he didn't offer any explanation either. Instead, he made a gesture, inviting the king to step into the room. "My little king, may I invite you to chat for a while with this old man?" Accepting the invitation, King Fintaran entered the room. Immediately, a weapon positioned right in the center of the room caught his eye. It captured his full attention. It was an imposing anti-material sniper rifle. which, like a sleeping beast, waited in silence for the moment to wake. His gaze remained fixed on that sniper rifle, unable to look away. Seeing this, Goblin Shui allowed a slight smile to cross his face, and he asked with clear satisfaction, "King Fintaran, do you like it?" He nodded without hesitation. After talking for a while, the king was left with no doubt. He was absolutely certain, ever since he had arrived in this world, this was the most perfect mechanical creation he had ever seen. "If you like it, King Fintaran, you may have it. Give it to me, and what," he wondered, "would the conditions be?" Upon hearing those words, Goblin Shui let out a great, booming laugh. "I wouldn't call them conditions. Sir, you can take what I am about to say as a simple request. A simple request. Whether you accept it or not, the choice is yours. This weapon is all yours." And so, King Fintaran took the sniper rifle into his hands. He familiarized himself with it for a brief moment and, immediately, began to disassemble it, only to put it back together again. His speed was such that even Goblin Shui, who had studied the weapon for years, was left completely astonished. When he finally finished reassembling the weapon, he looked up at the stunned Goblin Shui, who was still processing what he had just seen. It was then that the old man reacted. He said, "This old man hopes that you, sir, can go now. Go and save that goblin who threw himself onto the front lines. Furthermore, in the coming days, if you happen to see any goblin you consider worthy, and they find themselves in danger, I hope that you might be able to save them." Having said this, Gato Anko gave him a deep, respectful bow, although he wasn't entirely clear on what Goblin Shui meant by that. Regarding the specific danger he mentioned, he nodded and accepted anyway. He took the mission, seeing that he had accepted so easily. Goblin Shui was quite surprised. After all, goblins have many flaws, as we well know, and he had assumed that King Fintaran would feel a great sense of rejection toward them. But they only do what they do in order to survive in a harsh world. Thinking of those who were never given a chance to survive, Goblin Shui's expression darkened, and he asked suddenly, "King Fintaran, please tell me the truth. Is our way of surviving as goblins truly wrong? After all, as we know, there are no females within the goblin race. They can only reproduce by abducting the females of other races." He understood perfectly well why those other races hated them so much, but in his mind, they only wanted their species to be able to propagate and to continue. Goblin Shui became more and more agitated as he spoke. He looked up at King Fintaran, desperately waiting for some kind of answer. But, much to his surprise, the king responded with total indifference. How should he know the answer to that? If it's wrong, then it's wrong. There was no reason to overthink the matter so much, at least, not to him. Such blunt honesty left Goblin Shui completely at a loss for words. We see him lower his head, beginning to mutter quietly to himself. While Goblin Shui talked to himself, the king stored the anti-material rifle in his storage ring. Without paying any more attention to the old goblin, Fintaran stepped outside to observe the surrounding area. To be honest, he couldn't find a single trace of the other goblins anywhere. Meanwhile, Goblin Wa, wearing a fierce expression, was searching everywhere. That cursed brat, where on earth could he have gone? He told himself the boy better not be found, or there would be consequences. Right at that moment, Goblin was suddenly heard a very familiar voice. And it was accompanied, strangely enough, by the voice of a human woman. We see Goblin Wa peeking out from behind a wall to get a better look. It was Goblin Tai, and he was actually speaking with a human woman. In the blink of an eye, both of them suddenly vanished into thin air. Right at that very moment, Goblin Tai's voice rang out from directly behind him. He asked Goblin Wa what he was doing and exactly what it was he had seen. Deep down, Goblin Wa felt an inexplicable and crushing sense of oppression. Involuntarily, he took a step back, and seeing this, Goblin Tai simply offered a faint smile. At this point, he wondered what use there was in saying anything at all, while Goblin Wa was still busy asking himself that very question. And what those words could possibly mean, Goblin Tai's figure suddenly flickered. His sword shot forward like a bolt of lightning. The blade, heavily charged with spiritual energy, came crashing down with immense force. Goblin Wa let out a scream of absolute, heart-wrenching agony. He clutched his severed arm, his face a twisted mask of fury and pure terror. If he hadn't been on high alert, that single attack would have likely cost him his life. He demanded to know why, asking if he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. In that instant, a dark shadow suddenly plummeted from the sky above. With a devastating slash of spiritual energy, it struck Goblin Wa from top to bottom, and Goblin Wa released a final, blood-curdling scream. His body was split clean in two, and we see the truly gruesome end of poor Goblin Wa. But through it all, Goblin Tai remained completely unmoved by the spectacle. He simply remarked that this would make the cleanup much more difficult for him. Right at that moment, a human figure wearing a dark black cloak appeared. He stepped out from the shadows, wielding a dagger as black as jet. The blade was still dripping with Goblin Wa's fresh blood. He looked over at Goblin Tai, and a slow, mocking smile began to spread across his face. He chuckled, saying he had actually thought the traitor might feel some pity for his comrades, which, as we can clearly see, was a bit of an overestimation of his character. Chris reached into his pocket, pulled out a small pouch, and tossed it to Goblin Tai. As he caught it, a brief flash of fear flickered through the goblin's eyes. He hurried to offer his thanks, and then quickly left with his payment in hand. Chris also prepared to move on, carrying the latest information he had gathered. However, he soon realized that he seemed to have lost his way. Just as he was lamenting his situation and wondering what to do next, Chris suddenly sensed a very familiar aura nearby. It was the leader of King's Zone, a man who had been a ruthless assassin in his past life. Because of that, when he faced the enemies invading his nest, he didn't hesitate for a single second before attacking to annihilate them all. In that very instant, the great goblin who had been charging at the front appeared. He roared with utter helplessness, demanding to know why they were destroying his home. Well, because they are goblins, obviously. Is that the only reason? That is the only reason. They can massacre us whenever they please. Is that not reason enough? Kelu let out a cold, sharp laugh. The long spear vibrated once more in his grip. The great goblin's body was tossed aside like a ship swept away by a giant wave. He crashed with brutal violence against the cold wall of the cave. He spat out a mouthful of blood as his body slid limply down to the floor. And yet, we see that the great goblin refused to give up. He stood up slowly and declared with grim determination that he would kill them all, no matter the price he had to pay. But the only thing he received in return, the only response he got, was Kella's mocking laughter. What a pity, he chuckled. Right now, you are simply far too weak to do anything. You are powerless. And almost as soon as he finished speaking, Kelu gripped his spear tightly, prepared to deliver the finishing blow to the great goblin before him. However, just as the spear was in motion, and was about to pierce straight through the great goblin's body, the entire lair seemed to tremble under the weight of an invisible force. A deafening shot suddenly echoed throughout the cavern. Immediately afterward, a single bullet tore through the air. It lunged toward Kelu at a speed that was quite impossible to follow with the naked eye. Instinctively, Kelu felt a sudden aura of overwhelming danger. He quickly deployed his magic barrier. He was trying to block the surprise attack, but to his absolute shock, he discovered something. It turned out that his magic barrier, which was supposedly indestructible, meant nothing against the bullet. Kelu watched with his own eyes as the projectile tore straight through his shoulder. How could this be possible? He had his body's structural reinforcement fully activated. After all, a simple pistol or whatever it wasn't possible. It just wasn't possible. It could never pierce his body. He wondered what on earth was happening, and at that very moment, a sudden, dark shadow appeared right in front of the great goblin. It moved with the clear intention of snatching the badly wounded goblin away in one swift motion. Realizing what was happening, Kella screamed at the top of his lungs, "Mode!" Hardly had he finished speaking when a dazzling golden silhouette appeared. It arrived just in time, striking like a bolt of lightning. The figure lunged at the intruder. The owner of that silhouette was, indeed, Mode. He warned the stranger not to think they would escape so easily. But the stranger reacted quickly, lifting the great goblin and tossing him forward. And with a clever illusion, the newcomer skillfully dodged Mode's attack. In that moment, the pleasant voice of a girl suddenly echoed through the air. "J.E.J., are you still trying to run away?" she asked. Immediately after, a rain of burning fireballs fell from the sky. They were aimed directly at the intruder, and the shockwave of the fireballs forced him to retreat. Under the light of the dancing flames, Sina made her appearance with slow and elegant steps. The stranger's gaze was fixed on the three people standing before him. He could feel it deep down. Their power was immensely superior to his own. If he were to face them directly, he knew he didn't have a single chance of winning. Just as he was considering using Dejebulin as bait to make his escape, Korlu recognized exactly who they were, noting, "So, you're the one with the arm. Since you've come all this way," he added, "you're going to leave your life right here." The stranger challenged them to try, asking if they really thought he wouldn't dare to kill them. Korlu remained calm, certain that no one was going to escape him today. He cracked his knuckles, preparing himself to launch an attack. Suddenly, a metallic goblin voice echoed through the lair, changing the atmosphere entirely. A squad of heavily armed goblins appeared out of nowhere. They rushed out of the lair and lunged toward the outside world. Armed with rifles, they quickly moved to block the adventurer's path. "Attention everyone, aim," came the command. They prepared to fire at the direct order of the goblin captain. Every single gun barrel was pointed directly at our group of adventurers. Upon seeing this, the adventurers turned pale, and who could blame them, really? Chaos broke out in an instant, shattering the brief silence. In the midst of the sudden confusion, Korlu reacted without a second thought. He threw himself to the side, shielding Sina from what was about to come. At that exact moment, the goblin captain barked out another command. "Fire at will," he shouted, and he had barely finished speaking when the thunderous roar of gunfire erupted all at once.